Fault Lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for another edition and another week of the most disruptive show covering news, politics, and events from across these disunited states we like to call America and the increasingly divided surface of our globe. In the independent corner, I'm your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, a burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together, that means you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Good morning again, everybody. It's Monday, and I have a quick heads up. I'm going to be giving this disclaimer out throughout the week because it'll be relevant all of next week and the week after that, too. This coming week, Fault Lines, the show, is off. Just heads up. Jamarl and I are taking a vacation. Yeah, I'll let him explain where he's going. I'm going to the Pacific Northwest. I'm going to be off for another week after that. I'm taking a whole 2 weeks off here. I know. I'm very grateful for the opportunity. Anyway, I'm going to be off for 2 weeks. Jamarl will be off for 1 week. He'll be back the week after this one. I'll be giving this warning throughout the week, but just, heads up while folks are listening. Without further ado, let's get into COVID headlines. First up, in COVID stats, we have about 79,390 new COVID cases reported in the United States yesterday. There were also about 185 new deaths. Over the past week, there have been an average of about 150,000 cases per day. That's an increase of 36% from the average 2 weeks earlier. 51% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated at this point, and 60% of residents have received at least one dose of a COVID vaccine. And as of this morning, the coronavirus has infected about 37,777,600 people across the United States. It, meanwhile, has killed 628,285 people here in the U.S. Taiwan has begun distributing its first locally produced vaccine, despite concerns that it was approved before undergoing Phase 3 clinical trials. Taiwan's president took the jab live on social media. China has reported no new local cases today. This brings to an end the recent small wave of infections in the city of Nanjing. And America is amidst its fourth wave of the coronavirus. In a new poll enacted by USA Today and Ipsos shows that an overwhelming majority of citizens are for strict rules and mask mandates to contain the virus. 72% stated a mask mandate was a matter of health and safety, and 61% said they supported requiring the vaccine, except for those with medical or religious exemptions. When asked specifically, 70% agreed that people had the right to choose not to get the vaccine, but that they then do not have the right to be around vaccinated people. I want to come back to this one. In national news, track star Sha'Carri Richardson came in last place in her first race since being suspended for an illegal substance just before the Olympics. Jamaica winner Elaine Thompson-Herah clocked 10.54 seconds in the 100-meter race, which is good for the second fastest women's time in history. Wait, really? So a second fastest women's time in history was just made here in this race? That's really cool. Sha'Carri Richardson's taking the headlines, but that's a big one for Elaine Thompson-Herah. Anyway, Richardson would also go on to withdraw from the 200-meter race. In her post-race presser, Richardson told reporters that she's, quote-unquote, not done. But I hope not. Might want to talk about this a little bit later. In fact, there's a decent chance we will, just briefly, because I'm wondering, she was kicked out of the Olympics for smoking weed or taking weed or something. That might have been edibles, in my point. But, and then this, of course, is it just that she was out of practice? You would think that she would maintain her practice despite not attending the Olympics. If anything, that might just be like, okay, I'm just going to keep my training schedule up. Might even be easier. I don't know, though. After 1 year into the pandemic, a new study by the medical journal JAMA has found that 2/3 of U.S. children's calorie intake comes from ultra-processed or ready-to-eat foods. This includes foods like frozen pizzas, chips, and cookies. 1 in 3 pediatric patients was above their expected weight. It's a 41% increase from pre-pandemic data. In international news, the Taliban have said they will not extend the deadline by which American forces need to leave Afghanistan. That deadline is currently the 31st of August. They're saying that's a red line. A spokesman for the Taliban said that Biden had said troops would be out by that date and that extending it was simply extending Afghans' occupation. And the German army has said that a member of Afghanistan's security forces has been killed in a gunfight at Kabul airport, with a statement saying that a number of American and German troops were engaged in the firefight along with the Afghan National Guard. 3 other Afghans are injured, and it is unclear who started the firefight. Ukraine is hosting a diplomatic summit on Crimea today and tomorrow called the Crimea Platform Summit. They've invited almost every nation in the region except for Russia. Of course, the United States will be attending as well, and we will be talking about this later on with Bryan Mcdonald. We're also going to be talking about Afghanistan with him. That's at 7:30 later this hour. A former Indonesian cabinet minister has been sentenced to 12 years in prison after a court found him guilty of taking bribes while arranging aid to families affected by the pandemic. Investigators into the former minister discovered 7 suitcases holding more than $1 million in cash. In tech news, top Pentagon officials are reportedly trying to declassify details on anti-satellite weapons technology. Sources say the effort is headed by General John Hyten and was due to be unveiled at the National Space Symposium, which starts today in Colorado Springs and will run until Thursday. And PayPal is bringing cryptocurrency to the United Kingdom. The company is giving the ability to buy, sell, and trade Bitcoin, Ethereum, Litecoin, and Bitcoin Cash. No Dogecoin, though. To anyone with the app and their bank account linked. PayPal users will also be able to check out with cryptocurrency instead of cash, if desired. And with that, those are our headlines. You are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. I want to come back to the polling one early on, which shows that a majority of people in America want more stringent control measures. Enforced lockdowns, enforced vaccines, unless you have a medical or religious exemption.
Yeah.
That's probably the most shocking thing for me to see here, if I'm being honest with you.
I don't think so. I mean, if you think back to when, so I'll say it this way, it would be shocking to me if we had a situation where the numbers stayed flat and the public was like, yeah, we need more stringent measures. That would be weird to me. But, you know, when you think back to before, when people were like 5,000 people dying a day, you had like 70% of the country saying, yeah, we need to wear masks, we need to social distance, we need to lock down. And you would have this kind of large minority complaining about it. But the public, for the most part, back to position as long as the public thought it was in danger. If the public is now believing it's back in danger again, then it's not necessarily shocking to me that they would come to this kind of conclusion of, hey, maybe we need to do something.
That's not shocking. It's just 61% of people saying that basically everybody needs to get this shot. Everybody needs to be forced to get the shot.
The forced part is too much for me.
Because, again, 61% supported requiring the vaccine, except for those with medical or religious exemptions.
That's too much for me. That's too far.
And again, 70% agreed that people had the right not to choose, to choose not to get the vaccine.
Mm-hmm.
But then they don't have the right to be around unvaccinated people. They're different ways, they're trying to capture people's opinions on what level of requirement.
I don't think somebody has the right to be around me if they're unvaccinated. By the same token, though, I'm not shocked that the people would say it. I got to be honest, I am very edgy about this notion of forcing people to get a shot. I don't like that. People make the slippery slope argument for some of this stuff, and I'm like, yeah, the slippery slope argument doesn't necessarily always apply. But I mean, that part gets a little dicey for me. I don't like this notion of the government forcibly sitting somebody down to inject them with something. And I know people will say, well, what about schools and what about vaccinations when kids go to schools and stuff like that? Fair enough. But still, I'm a little edgy on that point.
Yeah.
I understand why Biden is trying to do this stuff, because he's trying to find any hook or by crook to force people to get a vaccine. And, the honest engagement needs to be whether or not the vaccine is going to be the only quiver or the only arrow in the quiver. And if so, what does that mean? Because if you really think about it, we've gotten to the point where it seems like the only thing that they have as an idea is, okay, well, we need to get boosters now. So wait, most of the world hasn't even been fully vaccinated, and now we're going for our 3rd vaccination? Yeah, pretty much. Okay, is there anything else? No, that's it. It seems like that's the only thing that they have in their quiver.
You mean as far as and technically a vaccine is definitely not treatment.
Right.
It's a prophylactic.
It's prophylactic.
Preventative. But still, that's as far as like medical interventions, not masks, not lockdowns. That's the medical intervention that they're recommending.
That seems to be the main thing, yeah.
Yeah.
And that concerns me. That greatly concerns me. Because if you think about it, I was reading the lab information over the course of the weekend, and you would see stuff like they would go back to age and time frame of the vaccine, meaning how old you are, whether you're immunocompromised, and for that matter, how long you've had the vaccine. So let's say 8 months, 9 months, it starts losing efficacy by like 20, 30 points. And so it's like you add that stuff together. I mean, in my case, it's like immunocompromised and got it in February. And so it's like, okay, so how much of this is even left that's functioning at that point? And then you start extrapolating that to some of the older population who got their vaccines first because they were the ones who were at the most threat, which means that the older population is more in threat and waning efficacy.
Oh wait, you got after February. We got in like
I got in like February or March.
I thought like April.
You got yours that late?
I think it was either March or April. I'm just thinking back to the time.
Yeah.
Because it might have been late March. My point. I'm just trying to because I think we got ours right around the same time.
Because it was like we came into the office within I came in maybe 2 or 3 weeks after getting the vaccine. But no, it's disconcerting because it doesn't seem like there is any, that there is any really good plan on this. Like, because outside of, okay, we're going to give you vaccines. Kids are still going to school. So they're sending kids to school. I seriously doubt there's any propensity to have another lockdown. I seriously doubt that there's going to be any propensity to lock down the economy. I don't think any of that stuff is there. They're going to get rid of the employment insurance. They've started opening up businesses. They started opening up countries. And so it's like, all right, so we are running into the teeth of this. And, 2 years in? And so this whatever might have been there that would have gotten people kind of say, okay, we're willing to go through all of that doesn't seem to be there anymore.
Yeah. And
so I don't know, I don't see an out for this. And I have not heard any plans going forward in regards to how to mitigate it.
It's true. 100% agreed. One of my big frames on this is, okay, yes, this pandemic, but also the next pandemic. What happens? And I'm not talking about COVID in a year or two. I'm saying another infectious disease. Yeah. Who knows how many decades, hopefully many,
but
until we see it. But the presumption is that we are going to see it. If we're running under the same political systems that we are now, and if some of the same people are alive during that pandemic that are alive during this one, how much are they going to trust what their government has to say compared to now? And does that make sense?
Yeah.
The actions that our government has taken and the governments around the world have taken, have they set the global public up for more confidence come another pandemic or less? In other words, is it going to work? Because this isn't the worst one that we can see. We were very worried that this would be very, very bad. And it's clearly quite bad, but it's not very, very, very bad. It's not
Spanish flu.
It's not Ebola on a global scale, and it's not killing 15 to 20% of the people that it infects like the Spanish flu was. Admittedly, the Spanish flu was older and we didn't have treatment for, the various pneumonias and other conditions that came alongside it that were not just immediately caused by it. But the point being, there's probably going to be another pandemic. Who knows how long before we see it. It's quite a bit worse than this one. And my main thought is, seeing that this isn't the worst it can be, a large part of this is like, okay, let's figure out the best practices so we can get this ironed out so that in future serious ones that we have to deal with, we can handle it well. And the sad state of affairs is that we're not set up for that at this point at all. People can see the absolute failure. They can see that we didn't manage to contain this thing. We didn't manage to stop it. We've gotten the worst of all worlds effectively.
That's what it feels like.
You've had the economic cutting off of our legs from the lockdown, You've had a bunch of people depressed and forced to stay at home. You've had millions of people die around the globe. The virus shows no signs of being contained. There's huge rivalries between these groups and the public over the most basic facts of what the virus is, whether it's a pandemic, whether vaccines work, all this stuff. But my point is, it's a sad state of affairs, and I'm really worried about what that sets us up for in the long run with the next one that we're going to have to deal with.
I got to be honest, I'm even worried about the credibility of this one, because it seems that the administration, this goes back to the Fauci stuff again. Even though Fauci is not necessarily in the limelight, the question came up about, whether Fauci was being honest, whether he should have lied, whether he should have. And, as a person who I accept a certain degree of, flexibility regarding trying to difficult political situations, but you can't keep doing that because at a certain point, you're just lying. And, when Donald Trump was gaming the evidence and gaming the information and everything like that, people had a conniption fit. Oh, my God, I can't believe Donald Trump is doing that. But the CDC is doing that now. CDC is doing it now.
Yeah.
In regards to the number of people who are infected with these kind of breakthrough variances. Because it's a political choice. Like a lot of this stuff are just political choices. And that's one of the most unfortunate things. Like when you made the point about New York, where you're like, wait a minute, these guys are just getting one shot and they're opening the businesses?
Yes.
How does that work? And then when you add in the Delta variant, and the Delta variant was cutting the efficacy of the vaccines, even with people with both vaccinations. Even with people with both vaccinations, it was still somewhat of an issue. But let's do this. Let's take this out because I'm hearing music. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Back in a moment.
Lines.
Radio Sputnik.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington. Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps make the show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. I've been watching over the weekend the number of people online and otherwise who have family members that are either passed from COVID-19, who've gotten ill from COVID-19. There's been some horrific cases where the person might have caught it from either a teacher or caught it from somebody else and spread it throughout their family who basically live with them. Many of the ERs and many of the ICUs in some of the states, I believe Mississippi, Alabama, I want to say, even though don't hold me to Alabama, it may be in one of the other states, ICUs full, especially in areas with very low vaccination rates. And you look over the course of the country, and it doesn't necessarily seem like this is under wraps. Not only is there a Delta variant in the wings, but you also have a Lambda variant behind the Delta variant that is waiting also to basically take root. This does not look good, nor does it look like it is under control. If I'm not mistaken, on Friday, we had 1,700 people die. Yes, on Mondays, the number tends to be lower, but it seems that the number is always low on Mondays. It tends to get more honest by the time you get to Wednesday or Thursday. The point that I'm making here is data is our friend. It is not a bad thing. The rub is, even if that data looks horrific, even if that data does not necessarily give us good feelings about the world, regardless of whether the data good feelings about the world or not, is secondary to the point that it is the world to which we inhabit, and I would rather have the information available than not. There are certain political decisions that are being made here. When Donald Trump made his political decision because he hated the fact what the numbers were, he didn't like the number of deaths and the people that were dying over the course of a day and the numbers going up. And so there was this attempt, there was this hint at potentially scrubbing the numbers, or at the very least being an intermediary between the numbers being released, meaning the administration being this kind of intermediary between the numbers being released. Well, of course, I'm going to be against that. It looks as if they're gaming the numbers for political effect. I hate to tell you, Biden seems to be doing the same thing. Right here, May 1st of this year, as the new variant, this is ProPublica. ProPublica does extremely good work. May 1st of this year, as the new variant was found foothold in the United States, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention mostly stopped tracking COVID-19 in vaccinated people, also known as breakthrough cases, unless the illness was severe enough to cause hospitalization or death. Now think about that. Meaning all of the numbers that you've been reading from the CDC going all the way back to May, each number as they're coming in, the number of deaths, et cetera, hospitalizations, the works, and of course, that number of how many people were infected. The CDC stopped taking those numbers, more or less, back in May. And so unless that person ended up dead, or unless that person ended up in the hospital, the numbers are basically scrubbed. That makes no sense. You're basically walking through a dark alley. And they are doing this, I would argue, entirely for political reasons. I mean, this goes back to the initial thing beforehand where it was this kind of conversation about the guidelines, about wearing masks indoors, some of the breakthrough cases, the studies that were taking place, I believe, in Massachusetts and some of the other states that were showing that they're, depending upon the situation, breakthroughs. Even the efficacy that we're seeing going all the way back, either for people who are immunosuppressed, either people who have up in the ages, meaning 8 months in, give or take. And at that point, you start seeing a drop in efficacy to the point of 20, 30 points. This is not good. It wasn't good when Trump was doing it. It's not good when Biden is doing it. They're trying to argue that, well, I mean, we don't really need those numbers unless the person is hospitalized. Are you being serious? Are you being serious? You don't need the numbers. You don't need to see how this responds into the population. You don't need to see whether or not, even if the person doesn't go to the hospital or not, don't you still want to know how many of these cases are taking hold? The more interesting question is it not against Biden's interests if that number gets high? And the answer is, of course, yes. This is existential for one Joe Biden. From Biden's point of view, his thought was that he was going to come in, he was going to be the adult in the room, he was going to put out the vaccines, he was going to ensure that people can get a hold of the vaccines, and then at that point, he can move on with the vaccinated public being basically protected. Didn't work that way. And not just didn't work that way. As the economy has started back opening up, the schools started backing up, as they started getting rid of some of the benefits or the unemployment benefits that were being given, all of this stuff is taking place within a context of numbers that seem to be going up and vaccinations that seem to be waning in their efficacy. Don't misunderstand me. It is still a protectant. It is still far better than not necessarily having anything at all. But I have great qualms with the administration taking a tack like this. I didn't like it when Trump was doing it. I don't like it when Biden is doing it. You lose credibility with your audience, and you're losing credibility at a time where it is vitally, vitally important. Right here, this is ProPublica. It's, quote, it's like saying we don't count, said Ingram after learning of the CDC's policy change. COVID-19 roared through her household. Ingram was the woman, they give the story of a woman who basically gets ill. It goes through her entirety of her household. And I think if I'm not mistaken, there are about 6 or 7 people in the household that get sick. But based on the way that the numbers are counted, those people wouldn't necessarily be counted. That is utterly ludicrous. The CDC told ProPublica in an email that it continues to study breakthrough cases just in a different way. Quote, this shift will help maximize the quality of data collected on cases of greatest clinical and public health importance, the email said. But were you doing that before? Were you doing it before? And the answer, of course, is no. If you started this in May, why would an individual or why would the government do this? Why would you get to a point where you think less data is better? Unless you're thinking less data is better for the administration and trying to craft a narrative to get people to get vaccinated, and you didn't want to complicate the message with, this additional data. Meaning it is far easier to say 98 to 99% of the people who get sick and die from COVID are the people who are unvaccinated. It is far more complicated, even if it's more honest, to say that there's a waning efficacy, and you can give those numbers despite the fact that the vaccine is still showing as a protector. They're different conversations. I'm just making the point that one is more honest than the other. And in the same way that it was a complete and utter fail, that Donald Trump was perfectly willing to try to scrub the data, I'm seeing, or I don't see, why it's okay that Biden is doing this. Here's another point. In addition to the hospitalization and death information, the CDC is working with emergent infection program sites in 10 states to study breakthrough cases, including some mild and asymptomatic ones, the agency email said. Well, yeah, they have to say that now because they're under pressure to explain why did they stop taking breakthrough numbers in May. I don't know. I'm enamored by this. And this gets to the whole credibility argument again. Right here, quote, they're missing large portions of the infected, said Dr. Randall Olson, medical director of molecular diagnostics at Houston Methodist Hospital in Texas. Quote, if you're limiting yourself to a small subpopulation with only hospitalizations and death, you risk a biased point of view. They're not risking a biased point of view. It is a biased point of view. But again, I'm trying to make the point that it's not just a biased point of view for a biased point of view. It looks bad to be in the Biden administration and have those numbers continually go up. To have your COVID numbers go up, if for this to get out of control, shows that you have basically failed at one of your very specific tasks that you needed to accomplish. He should not be given a pass on this any more than Trump should have been given a pass on scrubbing the numbers. It is a hard argument to make that less information is more, unless you're making the argument in a political sense, that it is far easier to take the message and say, the overwhelming majority of the people are going to be perfectly okay to 98, 99%. But again, it's not honest. Shane, they are losing credibility. And the losing credibility has to do with because they think they're playing this four-dimensional chess stuff as opposed to just being straight with the numbers. They don't want, from Biden's standpoint, I don't think any president wants the numbers to spike under their watch. I don't think any president wants that, especially when you get to a point where you have like 100 a day and then all of a sudden it goes to 1,700. That looks bad. It looks bad when you get back to 100 and something thousand people getting ill a day. That looks horrendous. And so what do? You either can have a real world solution to keep those numbers down in earnest, or you can just stop reporting some of the numbers. They chose the latter. And then my point is that's a political choice. It's not a scientific choice. And that's entirely for political reasons. And it cuts credibility. I don't think they realize how problematic it is when stuff comes out and it's like, oh, the government's lying again. And it's like, well, they're not lying, absolutely. But people who already are looking at this notion as, oh, these guys have been lying all the way through. These guys have been lying all the way through. They're changing their story. It just looks bad. And yeah, I don't believe for a moment it's accidental. What are your thoughts? I just think this is horrible. This is worse than the Fauci stuff. Far worse than the Fauci stuff.
But I see it as an extension of it.
It is.
It reminds me of, I'm not going to spell it all out because it's a pretty darn obscure reference. There's this great Philip K. Dick. He's a science fiction author, writer. He has this great short story, The Mold of Yancey, which I read when I was like 12 or 13 or something, and it changed how I saw a bunch of stuff. Again, I won't get super into it, but basically, he goes into a society that's sort of run by a smiling, fake dictator who dumbs the population down and tells them pablum. He gives them things that they, makes them happy to hear. It's pleasant to hear his voice, but it dulls them. It dulls their senses over time. It makes them more pliable parts of this larger political system. Anyway, main character goes into that society and just very briefly turns it all around, is still a totalitarian overlord, but instead becomes one that's like trying to enlighten the public, trying to make the public more intelligent, playing literally, I think, 3D chess is where he goes in the game back in the 50s in the short story. Anyway, I would prefer to steer away from totalitarianism. But I think that speaking to the lowest common denominator in the way that the White House has gotten used to on this crisis, as well as many others, has shown itself to be, especially with this one, largely a failure because it's white lie after white lie after white lie. There's this phrase in the sciences, you can look it up. It's called lie to children. A lie to children is basically an overly simplified explanation of a scientific concept that gets most of the meat of the message across without getting into the scientific nuances and intricacies that would confuse the vast majority of us.
Queen is worth 9 points.
That kind of thing. Yeah. Now, there are lies to children, and then there are just lies. And these are just lies.
How's this any different than Cuomo? How's it any different than Cuomo?
I don't know, man.
I mean, because if you're thinking about it,
covering up cases, covering it up. That's the key part of what you're talking about.
For political reason.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the entire reason that Cuomo did it. And, whether Biden may be able to make the argument of saying, well, we did that because we want to keep the message about the vaccines uncomplicated in order to get more people vaccinated, et cetera, et cetera. And we don't want people to believe that the vaccines can be, that the breakthrough cases are what they are because it made people think, okay, well, what's the point of me getting the vaccine? Meaning they can make that argument, but that's secondary to the point that you're still scrubbing your data and you're still on some level undercutting that data in order for that political effect, whether it's because you think it make you look better or whether you think you're, having your numbers spike under your term like that is existential. Either way, there's a political benefit seemingly to it to keep those numbers down. I wouldn't have tolerated this under Trump at all. And it's amazing to me that it's tolerated under Biden.
Yeah.
And the excuses just don't fly. I mean, it's like, well, I mean, we just want to have more effective readings. But you guys just started this in May, meaning you changed how it's almost like, okay, we're going to score this 90 to 100 as an A. And then the teacher comes in and says, okay, well, we're going to go from 84 to 100 as an A. But we're not going to tell you that we changed the grading scale. It's that. So if you're looking at the numbers and the numbers look low, you're like, okay, fair enough. Missing the fact that the numbers are, in fact, much higher. They have to be by definition on some level, right? Especially if you're getting rid of some of these cases. And we know that given certain conditions that the breakthrough cases do go through.
Well, it is grade inflation.
Yes.
Effectively, because it's to the benefit of the school in the grade inflation case. Yeah. To say, oh, we've got all these A+ students. Look at all of our A students. The worst anybody in our class has is a B. And then you look at the tests that they're getting, and B, it's just either the questions are easier or they've fudged the numbers slightly, and usually it's just that the questions are easier. No, that thing happens and it applies completely. But I guess here's where I would get maybe slightly controversial. I don't even know what this is, Jamarl. But I think this is where you and I at least disagree. I think the public it's been a year and a half now.
Yeah.
If the government had tried to have a diligent, honest, even high-level conversation about this stuff on an ongoing basis with the public, I think it would have worked. I think people broadly, I'm not saying everybody, I'm saying that our society is intelligent enough to engage in that conversation, to pay enough attention that enough people are really aware of the facts, are aware of the debate, etc. That hasn't happened. To be clear, what's happened is we've had an overly simplified explanation of some of our policies, why we're doing certain things. Then some of the, when we change our mind and we undo lockdowns or we reverse ourselves in different ways, we don't exactly explain that what's her name? Jen Psaki just dismisses it as, oh, the science has changed, as if that's anything other than just a hand-waving dismissal of the question.
Yeah.
If instead the government had been like honest, sort of, I don't know, not intermediaries, but honest players in this process where they're trying to like raise the public's level of awareness and genuinely engage any questions and concerns and curiosities they have. I'll put it like this. I wish that the conversation about liberty and lockdowns and tyranny from the government, whatever your take on it, I wish that had like been had in a public forum with the government and people, so that there could be this, you could see on TV this dynamic of people being like, but wait, you're telling me you want me to stay locked in my home, and I get there's this big disease going on. But the government's never told us to do that before, which is a valid thing to say. And then the government has to respond to that. And hopefully they have a good response that justifies it. If they don't, then what the hell are they doing anyway? You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I feel you on that. Yes, and I think I could agree with that mostly. Especially considering what they're doing now. Because like you said, it feels like that stuff was an extension. Look, I find this to be horrible in general, because to me this just comes across as lying.
Yes.
You had one grading scale, you changed the grading scale, and then didn't necessarily tell the public that you changed the grading scale. And so when people are seeing the numbers go up, the numbers are actually much higher than what they actually are showing. It's that stuff. Yeah, I keep thinking a better tact would have just been honesty.
That's what I'm saying. I think this might be one of the first times I've done this. I've been saying this for a very long time. I've been saying
the better tact is honesty.
The better tact is honesty. And even a couple of weeks ago, I was looking back at it. My new take is, I don't know about mandating lockdowns. I don't know about mandating masks. This is maybe utopian, but the best case scenario in my dream world is that the government does this. They act as a communicating body, and they try to educate the public. And, the government also, if people want to take time off of work because they're looking at the virus and they see this as a big concern, if businesses are like, hey, we need to shut down our doors for a while because if we keep our logging operation going or our meat packing plant going, a lot of people are going to get sick. And the government should be there to give them some help, because honestly, this is a crisis that everybody is having to fare with.
That's just it. I don't think that the government is going to do that. Like, I have a hard time believing that they're going to push through the lockdown thing. I mean, the issue in New York is probably a great example. They are aware that there's a virus. They're aware that the Delta variant is eating through, dependent upon the conditions, if you get the right conditions and the right person and the efficacy waning and all this other stuff, they're aware of it. But they're more concerned with the business in New York because on some level they have to be, right? People still need to eat. People need to pay for themselves.
At this point.
Right.
At this point.
But the catch is, what does that look like going forward? And do you see any propensity for the government to come around to, okay, yeah, we need to lock down. We can't keep this going like this. I got to be honest, I don't see it. I don't see it. It doesn't seem like, if they're gaming the numbers like this, you have to, I'm coming to this conclusion on some level that they're doing that on some level because they want to keep people going. I don't think they want to shut that stuff down.
No, that's true.
Is it disadvantageous to Biden's presidency if Biden has to come out and say, okay, lockdowns? Think of how many times he has to backstep already.
I get it, but think about it like this for a second. We should go to our break.
No.
I'll try to be very simple, but it's like a pendulum has swung in a weirdly opposite direction. Early on in the pandemic, they clearly prioritized individual safety over the health, stability, longevity even of our economy.
Yes.
Now it is completely reversed. Like you're saying in New York City, or in the case of Bill de Blasio with his key to NYC pass.
Yeah.
They really want to keep businesses open. And after the economy got hit hard, they're like, yeah, we don't care so much if people get sick and potentially die.
Yes.
A lot of people are vaccinated now. It's a little bit less likely, so let's let them free. The vaccines are a factor, but as we see with Delta, it's not quite as much of a factor as we'd like them to be. And the point is, without anybody having this conversation in public, the government seems to be just switching its policy.
Yeah.
And it's another case of this weird, deep shift that doesn't make sense. I feel like we should be aware of. I feel like we are aware of on a deeper level. And the government needs to explain to us if they want to retain our respect, their legitimacy, if they want to keep going.
I think that ship has sailed. The credibility thing is a big deal. And, it's like you deal with people constantly who's complaining about, oh, I don't want to do the mask. I don't want to do vaccine. Oh, the government is lying about this. The government is lying about that. Some of the stuff maybe, but this doesn't help. This doesn't help. Just looking at it, just in general, it's like you want to believe if the government comes out with something that it's not this, okay, yeah, but we're not going to tell people about this number and we're going to focus on this other stuff. You would hope it's not that. That makes the argument that much more difficult when you need people to actually believe that you're being honest.
Yeah. Let's go to a break.
Yeah.
You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Coming back, we'll be joined by Bryan Mcdonald. He is head on the Russia desk over at RT. We're going to be talking about the ongoing meeting starting today in Ukraine on Crimea. We're also going to be hitting Afghanistan, well, specifically the Taliban's relationship with Russia. Well, an older one. We'll be coming back to that one. We'll be going over some history here, of course, what happened during the late 70s, 80s. We're also going to be going over what's happened more recently, as with NATO forces withdrawing. Really, who are the big powers left in the region for the Taliban to deal with? As far as I can tell, it's Russia and China. Those are the main powers. The United States is withdrawing from that stage for now, it seems. Anyway, we're coming back with Bryan Mcdonald. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines. We divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today, get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we are joined by Bryan Mcdonald. He is head of the Russia desk at RT Online, and you can follow Bryan on Twitter at 27KHV over on Twitter. Bryan, thank you for joining us this morning or afternoon, your time. How are you doing?
All good here, and it's very much the afternoon. It's 2:30.
Exactly. And beautiful. Are you? Last I checked, you were over in Sochi. I'm just curious.
Mm-hmm.
You're still there?
I'm still here.
I hear it's
they haven't
beautiful.
deported me yet.
That's good to hear. All right, let's get into it. We're going to talk about Afghanistan and Russia. I want to start, though, with the Crimea Platform Summit starting today in Ukraine. Russia's not attending, but effectively everybody else in the region is. The United States is attending this meeting. Just briefly, what are the big takeaways from this? What is this summit? What do you see coming out of it, Bryan?
Well, basically, the Crimea Platform event is an attempt by Vladimir Zelensky to the Ukrainian president to basically cover for the fact that he has no plan whatsoever to deal with Crimea. Don't forget that when Zelensky took office 2 years ago, he promised that he would, last year, not 2 years ago, he promised that he would end the conflict in eastern Ukraine, the Donbass region, and he made various pledges about, sorting out the status of Crimea. These were central to his election campaign. I mean, don't forget that Zelensky was up against a guy, Petro Poroshenko, who primarily derived his support from the west of Ukraine, which is generally more militantly nationalist than the rest of the country. And his plan electorally was to gain support in the eastern and southern regions, which are more Russophone and more Russophile than the west part. And he did that by sort of adopting a conciliatory platform during the campaign, which he won resoundingly. Since he's taken office, though, he's been unable to make any progress on the east of Ukraine for the simple reason that in his heart and soul, Zelensky, especially given the fact he's from Kryvyi Rog in the center of Ukraine, which is a Russophone industrial part of the country, he understands that the only way to achieve peace in East Ukraine is to go for some kind of federalization model, which is mentioned in the Minsk agreements signed with Angela Merkel and the then French President François Hollande, and still supported by Emmanuel Macron, his successor. And the problem is that the nationalists in Ukraine, who wield exaggerated levels of power and influence compared to their actual electoral support, will simply not allow any concessions, as they would see it, to the pro-Russian, as they call them, separatists in eastern Ukraine. So what Zelensky has done is, realizing that his efforts in eastern Ukraine are completely hopeless because he can't fulfill the Minsk agreements due to the fact that the nationalist wing in Kiev and Lviv, which is a city in the west of Ukraine, won't allow it. He's decided to basically distract by going for this Crimea forum. Now, when you say, Shane, that a lot of people are attending this and a lot of countries are attending this, there's no big hitters at it, though. I mean, there's no heads of state of any notable countries. The Germans have not sent any top officials to it, for example. The Americans, so I understand, have sent diplomatic staff rather than any politicians. So
it's true. There's two people. The charge d'affaires. Go for it, Bryan.
Yeah, the charge d'affaires. It's a bit of a damn squib, to be honest with you, compared to what you might have expected.
Bryan, got a question for you. You mentioned that the nationalists they have outsized influence from their electoral numbers. What are the mechanisms of control? What ways do they have the capability of controlling Zelensky's actions on this, if he did indeed wanted to kind of have some kind of unification talks?
Well, they have the street. I mean, they have the ability to go on the street and to organize mass protests and bring down the government, possibly, if they could convince enough of the security forces to come on their side. And that's certainly a risk Zelensky doesn't want to take. I mean, no politician wants to be found hanging from a lamppost, without being too flippant about it. So Zelensky and any Ukrainian leader for the foreseeable future, as long as these guys wield this sort of influence, has his hands tied effectively as to how far he can go on resolving the conflict in the east of the country. And that's just the reality of the situation. I mean, we're talking about the Azov Battalion, which is a neo-Nazi formulation. We're talking about various other groups like the Aidar and various outfits like Pravi Sector, Right Sector, and the whole Svoboda gang of headbangers from the Galicia region. So basically, his hands are tied, and instead of dealing with the substantive issues, he's instead goes in for these big kind of PR events that basically result in nothing.
And Bryan, over your sort of umbrella question here, and then we're going to move to Afghanistan. But is it just the status quo for the time being? Is it just that these lines that the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics are just going to persist as political entities in allegiance with Russia, and nothing's going to change? You're going to be intermittent warring. For how long do you think that will last, basically, and what do you think is going to follow it, Bryan?
Well, Shane, and it's a little bit like Jamarl's question as well. I mean, the basic thing is that there's no way out of the situation right now. I mean, we're basically in a Hotel California situation, in the sense that Russia will not concede as long as Vladimir Putin is president anyway, and I would presume well beyond that, because anybody sitting in the Kremlin who would unilaterally withdraw from the Donbass would in effect be abandoning the people there, many of whom are Russian citizens, most of whom are ethnically Russian. So there is no way any Russian leader could abandon those people. That was why in the Minsk agreements, one of the ideas was federalization, so that those provinces would be autonomous to a degree and make their own, govern themselves to an extent. Kiev won't accept that. I mean, the odd thing is the majority of Ukrainians probably would accept that as a compromise just to end the war. I mean, and Zelensky himself. But the problem is the right-wing headbangers won't accept it. And as I said to Jamarl, they wield outsized influence. And that is the problem. And there's no real way to break up the right-wing guys within Ukraine. It would have to be done externally, really. It would require maybe American pressure or EU pressure. But America obviously has no appetite for that, because America's whole strategy for Ukraine, for the moment anyway, is to use it as a kind of, prop or a client state in order to basically upset Moscow. So why would America do that at the moment, unless America decides to become more conciliatory towards Russia for whatever reason, and then there might be some progress. But unless the US changes tack and decides to stop using Ukraine as a kind of geopolitical tool, unless there's some kind of liberal revolution in Moscow, and even then it will be unlikely, there's no way out of this situation. Like there's no way out. I mean, it's completely just a frozen conflict on the edge of Europe, and that's just the sad reality.
Wow, absolutely. You know what? And one quick thing here. I feel like it's relevant to bring up the two people that the U.S. sent. Like I mentioned, there's the charge d'affaires, interim charge d'affaires at the U.S. Embassy in Kiev. So our political local, basically. And then there's the Assistant Secretary for International Affairs at the U.S. Department of Energy, which is energy. If you think about how the United States views Ukraine, obviously a sort of potential proxy state and a kind of cushion is how we're framing it. A weapon against Russia, very clearly, but a cushion, as we like to portray it, between Russia and the European Union, but also an energy partner. And that's the whole thing with Nord Stream 2. We've been talking about the gas transit fees. We're going to go into a break. We're joined by Bryan Mcdonald. We're going to be coming back talking about Afghanistan and specifically the Taliban's relationships with Russia, the Afghan-Russian war back in the late 70s, 80s. We're going to be going into that and what the state of those affairs is, what those relations are like right now, looking into the near future as the United States withdraws from the region. And it's basically Russia and China as the large global major powers in the region left to arbitrate this conflict. Again, joined by Bryan Mcdonald, head of the Russia desk at RT Online. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be right back.
Fault Lines. Breaking news, expert analysis, and exclusive stories, all in one place. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
In a media landscape filled with so-called journalists acting as stenographers for their billionaire bosses, there is a desperate need for news, analysis, and perspectives that buck the status quo and get to the heart of how domestic and international events impact you and me, as well as showing how we can get involved in the struggle to change that status quo. Check out By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik, Monday through Friday from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, to hear the stories and voices that mainstream media refuses to tell you. And join us as we connect the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. That's By Any Means Necessary, Monday through Friday at 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, right here on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. We've been covering the fall of Afghanistan with the Taliban basically taking over on August 15th. One of the interesting things that is taking place right now is Boris Johnson wants the United States to extend its time beyond August 31st. The Taliban has basically said that is a non-starter and has said that is a red line, quote unquote, on the red line part. U.S. President Joe Biden announced that on the 31st of August, they will withdraw all military forces. So if they extend, it would mean that they are extending the occupation, while though there is no need for that, the Taliban spokesman said. It is unclear on what is going to take place in Afghanistan short of the United States leaving. What is more interesting here is what are the other players in the region, either China, Russia, Iran, and how are they, or let's say what kind of relationship they're going to create with this new Taliban 2.0 that's taking power. To have a conversation about this, we're joined with Bryan Mcdonald. Bryan Mcdonald is head of the Russia desk on RT Online. Bryan, again, thank you for joining us.
No problem, Jamarl. Just before we move on to this, I just wanted to make one final point about the Ukraine thing from before the break. Just what Shane said there. I mean, like, just the U.S. is not even sending its ambassador or its deputy ambassador to the Crimea summit. I think that speaks volumes for, the importance of the event.
No, that makes sense.
Absolutely.
Yeah, totally.
I think that kind of sums it up, really. It's.
Let me ask you this: what is the Russian point of view on the events that are taking place right now in Afghanistan, and what does Moscow want out of this situation?
Right. This is another matter entirely, so let's change the subject. Just one thing, Shane, I got to pull you up on. You said going into the break, you mentioned the Russian war with Afghanistan. There was no Russian war with Afghanistan. It was a Soviet war in Afghanistan. In fact, funny, we were talking about Ukraine earlier, because who was the person that ordered the Soviet Union into Afghanistan? It was a Ukrainian from Dnipropetrovsk called Leonid Brezhnev. So there you go. I think that's worth mentioning in this case. It was a Soviet war, and actually the head of the army at the time, Ogarkov, who was Russian, warned Brezhnev against it. But old sleepyhead didn't take his advice, and we are where we are. What happened. So basically what Russia wanted from the modern situation in Afghanistan, I think it's fair to say Moscow would have preferred if the United States had stayed longer for three reasons, really. First of all, because it was bogging the US down and they were wasting, materiel and treasure and, probably demoralizing their armed forces to an extent by fighting a war that they couldn't win. And secondly, because having the US there put some kind of control over the flows of opium, heroin, which heroin is derived from. Don't forget that Russia's borders a number of states that border Afghanistan, for example, so I think, a number of ex-Soviet states like Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan border Kyrgyzstan. And then you got Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan are not a million miles away either. So, and Russia obviously has security concerns. Tajikistan, for example, is a military ally of Russia's through the CTSO agreement, which is something like an analog of NATO amongst some former Soviet states. So Russia would have preferred that, the Americans had stayed for those reasons. But now that the Americans are gone, Russia would see the least bad situation as a secure, stable Taliban regime, provided the Taliban maintain the promises that they've made, it won't be a repeat of what happened, in the late 90s, where they're going to be sheltering people of the Osama bin Laden type and other terrorist groups. If they keep their word, yes, it is preferable to anarchy, obviously. And what Russia basically doesn't want to happen is the collapse of the Afghan state. And interestingly, which of course is never discussed in America, one of the reasons that it doesn't want to see a collapse of the Afghan state is afraid that it will leave a void that will be filled by terrorism, which will then be exported outside the borders of Afghanistan. And
I want to come in for a second here, Brad.
Can I just finish for a second? Because this is one of the reasons why Russia went into Syria in 2015 now, when it went into Syria, was because it feared the collapse of the Syrian state, and that the collapse of the Syrian state would turn Syria into a breeding ground for terrorists, like we saw in Libya, for example. And American media never discusses this. It just sees bad Putin went into Syria to prop up evil Assad, or bad Putin went into Syria to, throw down a challenge to the United States. That's how your media covers it. But don't forget that these places like Afghanistan and Syria are not very far from Russia, and that terrorism, Islamic terrorism in Russia, was a big feature in the country, a decade ago and 2 decades ago. And it's unstable states like that breed terrorists, and that's what I'm trying to say.
That makes perfect sense. And the addition of Syria is a valid, not just historical reference, but also clearly an analog for what we're talking about right now. But for a Western audience, not just an American audience, I think we view the Taliban taking over as a failed state. But it's clear, or at least suggested, that that's not what you see happening. For a Western audience, what's the distinction? Why is the Taliban, which we view in the West as this terrorist insurgent force, that them taking over to us, we perceive that as a failure? But why do you think that isn't, if I'm reading you right here, Bryan?
In actual fact, it was your American, I'm not saying you personally, but the American sponsored state that was the failed state, which has been proven, considering it collapsed in about 24 hours once the Americans started to leave. Any state that is completely reliant on external support to survive is obviously a failed state. Is that a fair definition?
Yes.
Yeah.
So the failed state was actually the American-backed state, because it couldn't survive for more than a day or two without foreign military there to prop it up. So the Taliban state, in a sense, is far more secure than the state it's going to replace, because it's an internal construct that can survive on its own military power. Although it's worth noting that it hasn't taken over the whole country yet. There are pockets of Mujahideen resistance in some parts of Afghanistan.
Sure.
Yeah, that's the interesting part too, the resistance aspect of this. Do you think that this is going to go forward? Once before, the Taliban didn't have all of Afghanistan prior, but on this one, it seemed to be stronger than what they were the first iteration. One, I guess the question is, do you think they're going to be able to take the entirety of Afghanistan? And if not, is that going to create this kind of breeding ground for other groups, let's say maybe even groups from the West, that still try to get this kind of continued insurgency taking place within the country?
Well, I am no expert on Afghanistan. I will not claim to be one, so I can't answer the fullness of that question, Jamarl. But I can just say that I can only suppose that after having 20 years to think about where they went wrong the first time, it's probably, given them some better ideas maybe for their second go at the bite of the cherry. I can just say from the Russian perspective, which is what I'm on to talk about, that as far as Moscow is concerned, the jury's out in the Taliban. I mean, it still regards the Taliban as a terrorist organization, but the Taliban has visited Moscow. Well, I mean, leaders of the Taliban have visited Moscow. They've made some pledges to Russia already, such as that they won't cross the borders into Tajikistan, for example, that they won't, that they will protect Russian diplomats working in Kabul, and they have honored those promises so far. So Moscow will play a waiting game to see how far the Taliban can be trusted. And if the Taliban double crosses Moscow in some way, I'd say the gloves might come off. I'd say that's probably what will happen. And I guess China's probably playing a similar game, although you'd have to ask a China expert that, but that's what I feel from what I see.
And then I will turning to China for a second. We're going to be speaking with Carl Jha later from the Chinese end about how they view the Taliban. How do you think Russia, how do you think Moscow views China and the Taliban? It's a little bit more obscure, but again, just setting this up, Russia and China are now the key global players here. The United States is withdrawing, apparently, unless we choose to get involved again, which I don't think we actually will in short order. So it's going to be Russia and China. What does Russia view its partner and its sort of counterparty here? How does it view China trying to relate to the $1 trillion lithium deal and rare earth mining deal? How does it view that relationship?
Well, I can tell you very simply that I can actually make it a little bit more interesting, because what I get from talking to experts in Moscow, where I was last week, actually all week, and the week before, what I get from talking to experts in Moscow is that they believe that what has happened this month, marks the moment in history when China replaces America as the most important country in the world in terms of geopolitics and in terms of, international, I suppose, credibility, in the sense that I think in America itself, I think people don't fully realize how much of a humiliation this is for the United States when viewed in other parts of the world. I mean, it looks like the optics are just terrible. Don't forget that, I know Saigon was an embarrassing episode in the 70s, but don't forget that at that time, we didn't have the internet to such a degree. We didn't have, we didn't have internet to any degree. I mean, the World Wide Web to any degree. I meant to say we didn't have the same global information flows that we have nowadays. Sorry, to phrase it better. Back then, many people around the world didn't even own a television, and many parts of the developing world didn't have color television. It's a different era. This is something that's all over social media. In the wastelands of Africa, in the poorest parts of Asia, people can watch this on a smartphone if they have one or if a friend has one. And it's just the global scale of, the damage it's done to American, prestige. And China appears to be filling the vacuum. And what's interesting is that China seems to be filling the vacuum in so many places that America once wielded, unquestioned influence. I mean, you even see China pushing into Latin America. You could say that China has already supplanted the US and Europe, for that matter, the European Union, for that matter, in Africa. You even see China getting involved in places like Ukraine, which is effectively an American client state. And now we see China as effectively the top dog in Afghanistan. And that's what the Russians would see. The Russians would see this as kind of, that historians will look back on this moment in the same way that maybe we look back on Suez as, the end of the British and French, influence.
We've got to close it out here, Brian, but we were talking about that last week, and we're going to be talking about this next hour. And what we were saying, just briefly, we got to come back on this with you some other time, is this is the sort of beginning of that phase. The next time we decide to start a war, the next time something like this happens, and our allies don't come along with us, but instead they side with China, I think that will be the end of this sort of liminal period, this transitional period, in which it's becoming clear we're no longer the top dog. We got to close this out, though. Bryan Mcdonald, head of the Russia desk at RT Online. Thank you for joining us. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Back in just a minute with headlines.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, precipitously perched at the edge of this resilient and exploited globe. Welcome to your context lens for the American perspective. In the left corner, I'm your ever-vigilant, your indefatigable political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I'm your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And that will mean you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Really good conversation. The Suez Canal thing, we were talking about that last week, if I'm not mistaken, on Friday. The canary in the coal mine stuff. Again, Chalmers Johnson, he mentions this in some of his lectures and in his books. This notion of this kind of turn of the worm where the world recognizes a change or a turn. And that stuff, doesn't necessarily always become clear until after the fact, but you could find events where you're like, right there, that's where it seems to.
And you're talking about, of course, about the Suez Crisis.
Yes.
In which the United States basically intervened to push away
the UK.
Great Britain.
Pretty much, yes.
Yeah.
But let's get to the headlines. In the news, about 79,391 new COVID cases were reported in the United States yesterday, and there were about 185 new deaths. Over the past week, there's been an average of about 149,675 cases per day, an increase of 36% from the average 2 weeks earlier. 51% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated, and 60% of residents have received at least one dose. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected 37,777,607 people across the United States and has killed 628,285 men, women, and children. Taiwan has begun distributing its first locally produced vaccine, despite concerns that it was approved before undergoing phase 3 of clinical trials. Taiwan's president took the jab live on social media. Continuing in COVID news, China has reported no new local cases today, bringing a recent small wave of infections in the city of Nanjing closer to an apparent end. America is in the midst of its fourth wave of coronavirus, and a new poll enacted by the USA Today and Ipsos shows that the overwhelming majority of citizens are for strict rules and mask mandates to curtail the virus. 72% stated a mask mandate was a matter of health and safety. 61% supported requiring the vaccine except for those with medical or religious exemptions. When asked specifically, 70% agreed that people had the right to choose not to get a vaccine, but they then do not have the right to be around vaccinated people. Yes. In national news, track star Shar Chari Richardson came in last place, 9th of 9th, in her first race since being suspended for an illegal substance just before the Olympics. If I'm not mistaken, it was marijuana. Jamaican winner Elaine Thompson-Herrock clocked 10.54 seconds in the 100-meter race, which is good for the second fastest woman's time in history. Richardson will also go on to withdraw from the 200-meter race. In her post-race presser, Richardson told reporters that she's, quote, not done. She's not done. After 1 year into the pandemic, a new study by the Journal for American Medicine Medical Association has found that 2/3 of U.S. children's caloric intake comes from ultra-processed or ready-to-eat foods. This includes foods like frozen pizzas, chips, and cookies. 1 in 3 pediatric patients was above their expected weight, and 41% increase from pre-pandemic levels. In international news, the Taliban has said they will not extend the deadline by which American forces need to leave Afghanistan, saying that the 31st of August is a red line. A spokesman said that Biden had said that troops will be out by that date and that extending it was simply extending Afghanistan's occupation. The German army says that members of the Afghanistan security force has been killed in a gunfight at Kabul airport, with a statement saying that a number of American and German troops were engaged in a firefight along with Afghan National Guard. 3 other Afghans were injured, and it is unclear who started the firefight. Ukraine is hosting a diplomatic summit on Crimea today and tomorrow called the Crimea Platform Summit. They've invited almost every nation in the region except for Russia. If I'm not mistaken, there are going to be 45 different nations there. But as was stated earlier by Bryan Mcdonald, there's not really any big names of the people or the countries that are going there. A former Indonesian cabinet minister has been sentenced to 12 years in prison after a court found him guilty of taking bribes while arranging aid to families affected by the pandemic. Investigators into the former minister discovered 7 suitcases holding more than $1 million in cash. Wow. Top Pentagon officials are reportedly trying to declassify details on an anti-satellite weapons technology. Sources say that the effort is headed by General John Hayton and was due to be unveiled at the National Space Symposium, which starts today in Colorado Springs and will run until Thursday. They wanted this weapon to be released earlier. There was supposed to be a demonstration in addition to a release of the data on the weapon and some kind of space-based weapon. And like I said, they were going to do a demonstration of that weapon during the time where they were releasing Space Force. With COVID, the pandemic, and everything else that was going on, it got pushed back. But apparently they're still talking about disclosing this space-based weapon.
And one quick comment here, Jamarl. If there is any event that I really wish we'd had the foresight to be let's go to this event. You can fly out to this event, or I can fly out to this event. It would be the National Space Symposium.
Oh, yes.
The global international event for all matters space.
That would be very cool.
Space technology.
That would be very cool.
Exactly.
I mean, they're trying to apparently. It's very wild. I mean, when I was reading the stuff, when they were talking about Space Force and stuff like that, apparently they were trying to have this disclosed when all of that stuff was taking place. It sounds like whatever the weapon is, it's some kind of satellite weapon or some kind of satellite killing platform or something.
Anti-satellite, an anti-satellite, but they say
they're going to say it's defensive,
to take down,
quote unquote.
Could also be used to take down spacecraft, though.
Yes.
Not just satellites.
It's not just satellites, right?
Not just unmanned satellites.
Yeah, and then the question becomes, okay, this means that there are now going to be a weapons race in space. There has to be, right? PayPal is bringing cryptocurrency to the United Kingdom. The company is giving the ability to sell, to buy, sell, and trade Bitcoin, Ethereum, Litecoin, and Bitcoin Cash, no Dogecoin though, to anyone with the app and their bank accounts linked. PayPal users would also be able to check out with cryptocurrency instead of cash if desired. And last, Tropical Storm Henry made landfall yesterday in Rhode Island. The brunt of the storm will be between Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New York. More than 100,000 power outages have already been reported, and 86 people have been rescued from flooded vehicles. Over 1,000 flights have been canceled due to the storm. Still, New York Governor Andrew Cuomo has deployed 500 National Guard troops and around 1,000 state policemen to assist those affected. Those are your headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. I want to go back to the story about, I'll just read it. After 1 year into the pandemic, a new study by the Journal for American Medical Association has found that 2/3 of U.S. children's caloric intake comes from ultra-processed, ready-to-eat foods. This includes things like frozen pizzas, chips, and cookies. 1 in 3 pandemic pediatric patients was above their expected weight, a 41% increase from pre-pandemic levels. And of course, that makes sense as to why, right? They're stuck at home. They're not getting as much exercise as you would ideally on normal circumstances get. From the standpoint of the food thing, I find that to be extremely interesting because that seems to just be a factor of the way we go about our affairs in this country. And I'm taking it from my mom, for example. In the mornings, I used to be at my highest 260 pounds when I was in school, when I was in high school. I think I was 16 years old. In the mornings, we would stop to get something to eat from like Lucky's or one of the convenience stores. And then during the daytime, I might get something for lunch, maybe not. And then you get something in the evening. Now, the catch is, if you have a parent that works all day, especially if it's a single parent, fixing breakfast in the morning is not something that they necessarily have time to do. And even doing things like fixing dinner at night takes a certain amount of energy that you may not necessarily have after you've devoted all of your time during the course of the day, meaning all of your energies and everything else over the course of a day. This seems to be like a environmental thing where, the ready-to-eat processed stuff, no, that's clearly not good. If you're looking at things like diabetes, weight gain from the standpoint of kids, well, right here, it's that stuff. And so it's like, okay, how do you get around that, though? And isn't that more of a lifestyle thing in order to try to change that? Meaning if a parent was working from home, okay, then it may be a little bit easier to fix breakfast. If a parent wasn't near, let's say, a food desert, or if the parent wasn't necessarily by themselves, maybe it's easier to fix dinner in the evenings. Short of that, it is kind of difficult to pull that stuff off, especially if it's a single parent. But I mean, that's my thought. I see that number, and that number is ghastly.
It is ghastly. Yeah, that number makes me sort of physically ill when I think about it for a little bit longer.
Yeah.
Because, not just the quality of the food, which admittedly in a lot of cases it's tasty, it leaves you feeling terrible.
Yeah.
But of course, it's like the extent of it and who it's affecting. Kids.
Yeah.
Where if you get into a mode where you're obese, that affects you across the span of your life in those developmental years in a way that's really quite dangerous.
Yes.
And, I was a chubby little chubster as a child.
Yeah.
I grew out of that, thankfully. But I think have to deal with some lingering, like autoimmune stuff and just stuff that my body wasn't designed to be in that mode.
Yeah. And keep in mind, when you're kids, when you are 4 to 6 or 4 to 8, you get habits that basically stay with you your life, especially from the standpoint of eating habits. This is the reason why McDonald's, Burger King, these fast food places, have these Happy Meals and everything else. It is hard to extricate yourself from that stuff.
It is true. And I agree. And I agree completely. And I'm going to not disagree, but add another layer that I really don't see anybody talking about, but it's a little bit more fringy or something. But first, if you combine fat and sugar/carbohydrates and give them to people, that's the most addictive thing. I know people, I've been on a ketogenic diet. I've never been on a high carb diet, but I've been on a couple low carb diets. Reason for saying that, I know people who've done high carb diets and done okay. Yeah. It's just you don't want to, and the same thing, of course, with high fat, low carb diets. You just don't want to mix them. And all effectively popular processed food, junk food as we call it, is a combination of a lot of fat and a lot of carbohydrates and not that much protein, which protein is what tends to give you satiety. It's what tends to make you full. You'll notice this if you eat a protein-rich meal, like salmon, for instance. If you have a bunch of salmon, technically there aren't that many calories comparatively compared to a lot of other things you could eat, but it'll leave you feeling quite a bit fuller than a lot of those other high-calorie foods leave you feeling. And so it creates this cycle where people eat more. They're getting a lot of energy into their system that their body converts into fat, of course, doesn't know how to deal with sugar, their insulin levels spike, all this stuff. But here's the other side that I was looking into the other day, and I'd love to get somebody on this, but it's kind of weirdly fringy. A great article. I'd be happy to send it to anybody if they're interested in it. I just don't want to give it out in public because I don't fully support it necessarily. But it's just interesting sort of theoretical. They're looking at obesity over the last century, and they're looking at geographical maps of its distribution. And in the United States, what it maps to basically is elevation and how close you are to major watersheds, which is like, what? Wait, what are you? I can get into it.
What?
Exactly. And I can send you the thing. It's this good, interesting breakdown of it where they look at people on all these different diets. Those don't make that much of an impact. They look at like leptin and ghrelin, which are these two hormones that your body uses to maintain your weight at a certain level. They say, well, what's affecting? It's like the barometer of your body, or the thermostat sort of, for the desired amount of fat. They look at that. They look at all these different things. And what they conclude at the end, tentatively, is that pollutants, contaminants, of which there are many, that are released through industrial civilization, that have gotten increased over the last 100 years, but really the last 50, 60 years, that those are concentrated in water, that those watersheds bring them down to the coast. And so if you look at the highest obesity populations, they're like the Mississippi Delta, all of them, at the end of this big watershed where all of these pollutants and contaminants would have flowed down. And then whether it's the water that people are drinking or local agriculture and what the animals are eating, because here's the thing, it's this horrible trend. They look at rates of obesity consistently have gone up everywhere, but not just among humans and not just among cattle and chickens and things like that, which have also experienced higher rates of obesity. It's also among wildlife. Local wildlife is getting more obese. And the way that it maps to height and water, it's just very interesting. And I don't hear that being talked about, but I don't know who to talk to about it because it's not like, as far as I can tell, a field of active, popular scientific research. I don't know who to talk to,
But it makes sense on a certain level. I mean, basically the body is being undermined over the course of a life, but we don't necessarily see it as undermined just because it's the way we go about our daily life.
Exactly.
And so it's like, it's so normal, even though it's not normal in a weird way.
And so it's not like how that could work, for instance, just to give you a very simple example.
COVID and air pollution.
Well, something like that. But here's what I mean. It's like those contaminants, the pollutants, those can change your body's hormone levels, which might change where your body sets its thermostat. So again, ghrelin, this hormone chemical in your body that you use to sort of determine how much body fat you want to keep on at any one point. It'll make you skinnier, and you can sort of shift this over time. If those pollutants are shifting that level, then your body could just be aiming for more and more fat. But there's also very clearly genetic differences. If you look at twin studies, it's very clear that genetics is a key factor in this. But also it can change. Anyway, it's just all this different stuff. My point is, what you brought up and what the headline brought up is where I was, and I think that's extremely relevant. But at the same time, if there are pollutants that are just inclining us towards obesity. That's a serious, serious problem that we need to work on solving, you know?
I mean, don't get me wrong. If we're adding in sugar and all that stuff, I tend to lean more on that side. But I'm not shocked by, if there are pollutants that are screwing with our body's chemistry. I mean, like I said, the COVID stuff, COVID and air pollution, for example. Like the number of people who are dying from air pollution and stuff like that go up higher. And we don't, that stuff seems almost invisible to us because we just look at it as these are societal trends. The person just got sick. People get sick in general, et cetera. Yeah. But, I think what Dr. Kogan is saying is somewhat right here. And this kind of even gets to the whole COVID stuff about, is there something else other than just vaccines? And is there something to say about hardening the body? And is it even possible in this day and age to do something like that? I'm not quite sure it is. I mean, it's almost like we would have to organize ourselves around this idea of health and public health and caring about the individual and how they pursue their life.
You mean we, but for any individual you, there's a hopefully at least a decent chance that they can make some difference. Yeah. Changing this, losing weight or whatever it looks like. 'Cause it's not always losing weight. Sometimes it could be gaining weight or just body recomposition, whatever. But that process is clearly hard. People fall off diets easily. But I get what you're saying statistically. On a sort of epidemiological statistical basis, that's a real hard thing to change. But for you, whoever you are, if you're like, I want to change this, have at it. I wish you all the best. You have a much better chance than all of our population does. I just don't want to discourage people from, doing that.
No, I lost 100 pounds. Yeah, you can do it.
Yeah, totally. Same.
Definitely doable.
Same.
But let's do this. You guys are listening to Fault Lines. Thomas is Stranahan. We're coming back with Carl Jha. This should be a great conversation on China and what it's trying to get out of Afghanistan. Back in a moment. Fault Lines.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps make the show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. We've been having this conversation about the fall of Afghanistan, and we've had many people who've been on talking about either Russia's take, including Bryan Mcdonald on the last episode. But one of the more interesting players also has to do with China. And in the way that Bryan Mcdonald made the point about the Suez Canal and this kind of changing of the guard, he made this point about China and how this, in some level, is considered a certain canary in the coal mine of things to come, this kind of change of leadership of sorts. We are very curious on what's China's take on what is taking place in Afghanistan right now, and what does Beijing want to accomplish in Afghanistan with America leaving. To have a conversation on this, we're joined with Carl Jha. Carl Jha is host of Silk and Steel podcasts focused on China and surrounding regions and their history, culture, and politics. Carl, how's it going? Thank you for joining us.
Hey, thanks for inviting me again.
Absolutely. So let's start at the basics of this. Afghanistan has fallen. The United States is basically leaving supposedly on the 31st. And the big players seemingly in the region now are either going to be Russia, China, and potentially Iran. What does China, from the standpoint, from its framing of the world, if it could get let's say, what it wants out of this situation going forward. What exactly does Beijing want out of Afghanistan, meaning out of Taliban control?
That's very simple. If there's one thing that China really wants in Afghanistan is stability, because China borders Afghanistan. And the last thing China wants is to see Afghanistan turn into a haven for terrorism, because Taliban has a history of hosting the ETIM, or now rebranded Turkestan Islamic Party, which is a Uyghur jihadist outfit. And China actually has been in talks with Taliban even before 9/11. Back in 2000, China actually met with a Taliban leader, Omar, to discuss specifically asking Taliban do not host the ETIM on Afghanistan soil. And after 2001 U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, China actually maintained a very friendly relationship with Afghanistan government. In fact, since 2014, China has hosted multiple talks, peace talks between Afghanistan government under Ghani and Taliban. So there have been multiple rounds of, because China, while it's very friendly with Ghani's government, it also has maintained a working relationship with Taliban, because China recognized that is the reality of the country. But the peace deal, the peace deal didn't come to fruition, because right after China started to host bilateral talks with the Taliban and Afghanistan government, in 2016, U.S. drone attack kills then Taliban leader Akhtar Mansour, and so that put a dent to the ceasefire talks. But then, as late as just less than a month ago, in July 28th, China very publicly invited the Taliban delegation to China, basically to discuss the future of Afghanistan. So from China's perspective, Taliban is not China's top choice, but China pursue a very pragmatic foreign diplomacy, which means whoever end up taking power, China will have a working relationship with you. I had been talking about China-Myanmar relationship before on the show. It didn't matter whether it was a military junta or Aung San Suu Kyi taking the reign of power in Myanmar. China will always work with whoever happened to be the Myanmar leadership, and that applies to Afghanistan as well. So before, China has a very friendly relationship with Afghan government in Kabul, and now China will try to have a working relationship with the Taliban. Most specifically, China wants to see Afghan stabilize. It will pressure the Taliban again not to host Uyghur militants that could launch attacks into China's Xinjiang region. And lastly, China very much would see, to bring Afghanistan into the fold of Belt and Road Initiative, so to speak, because China is already investing a huge sum of money into neighboring Pakistan, and just as of last year, they have been talking about connecting, extending the CPEC project into Afghanistan, building a road connecting Peshawar in Pakistan to with Kabul. So so all these project is pending on when the dust settles, how Taliban intend to govern the country.
And working with either the Ghani government, or really with both the Ghani government and the Taliban, trying to maintain cordial relations and doing that. That's the pragmatism that I've come to see as characteristic of China when it comes to a lot of this stuff. What about, can we get into, you mentioned just now we got into some of the interesting economic arrangements, interventions came to mind, but that's the wrong word. That reminds you of U.S. interventions of an entirely different sort. But regardless, you get where I'm coming. China's relationship with Pakistan and this $1 trillion lithium rare earth mining deal. Anything else we should know about? You just mentioned the CPEC and the sort of offshoot of that could be linking Kabul into this trade corridor between the Pakistan coast and China. Anything else? You got the $1 trillion lithium deal. Anything else we should be aware of here, Carl?
Yeah, actually, China had been the largest foreign investor into Afghanistan since 2007, when China Metallurgy Corporation signed a lease deal with the Afghan government talking about developing a copper mine deposit in Mis Ainak, which supposedly potentially is the world's second largest copper deposit. But that project never took off because the security situation in Afghanistan have deteriorated. In fact, there was a Taliban attack on the facility very soon afterwards. So that mining operation very much remained on paper. And so that's one of the things that China very much like to see is to see the Afghanistan's security situation stabilize. So it could actually go in and kickstart this investment project that it had signed previously with the previous Afghan government.
I'm going to take us to a slightly early break here. I want to come back. We want to get into this conversation we were having earlier about the canary in the coal mine that was the American withdrawal from Afghanistan. What comes on the other side of this? To set you up for this conversation, Carl, we're talking about how with this withdrawal and the international diplomatic disgrace that it clearly is, shameful, for the world community, our allies, the other NATO countries that were involved here, the fact that we're leaving our own citizens behind and now are struggling to get them all out. It's obvious this is shameful. This is a canary in the coal mine we see for the sort of decline of the U.S. as this major imperial power, which of course had been a long time coming, and the ascendancy of China. We were hitting that with Bryan Mcdonald last hour, talking from Russia's angle, from Moscow's angle, how they see this happening. But we want to come back with you and see if you think that's right, if you think that's wrong, where you think this is going. We are joined on the line by Carl Jha. For those listening, Carl Jha is the host of the Silk and Steel podcast focused on China and surrounding regions in their history, culture, and politics. Follow Carl on Twitter at Carl Jha. That's Z-H-A. Follow the podcast on Twitter at SteelSilkN, and subscribe to support the podcast at patreon.com/silkandsteel. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be right back.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
They're bringing drugs. They're bringing crime.
I like beer. Yeah, we drank beer.
Whoever's in charge, and I want to record.
Let's talk about that.
Discussing all the controversies and news across the disunited states of America. Tune in to Fault Lines every weekday from 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern, only on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we are joined again by Carl Jha. He's the host of the Silk and Steel podcast that's focused on China and surrounding regions and their history, culture, and politics. Follow Carl on Twitter at Carl Jha. That's C-A-R-L-Z-H-A. Follow the podcast on Twitter at SteelSilkN, and subscribe to the podcast to support it at patreon.com/silkandsteel. Carl, as we went out, we were talking about the withdrawal from Afghanistan, the absolutely bungled withdrawal from Afghanistan, as a canary in the coal mine that the United States is losing its #1 seat as the international arbitrator for conflict and effectively as the international imperial power. We were talking with Bryan Mcdonald last hour about how it seems like we have effectively ceded that to China simply by our own inaction, our own mistakes. What I was saying earlier, what we were talking about with just Jamarl and I, basically, this is the start of this period. This is a start of a sort of liminal transitional period during which this is happening. That will probably end, or at least we'll see. I think that will end when we either call for a war with our allies and they choose not to intervene, or something very similar. Basically, when we try to depend on all of these parties that we were used to depending on, and instead of siding with us, they decide to either stay out of it or side with Russia. or China. Where do you fall on this one? Do you think that, the idea that this is the canary in the coal mine, do you think that's right? What's your take, Carl?
Well, I can't swear, but the fiasco in Kabul, that's obviously didn't do any wonders for the U.S. image abroad. But at the same time, there is a line of thoughts among the national security establishment in Washington that U.S. need to withdraw from Middle East, from Afghanistan, in order to focus on what they call the Indo-Pacific region, in the area surrounding China. So U.S. can redeploy its military asset to focus on an area like Taiwan. But again, the picture coming out of Kabul is not pretty, and already we have there's already narrative management. Taiwan premier actually said, "Oh no, what happened in Afghanistan will not be repeated in Taiwan." They're already volunteering themselves, and so there's that. But at the same time, I think the process of withdrawal from Afghanistan started under Trump, and this is a continuation under Biden administration. And there are quite a few people among the national security establishment that were firmly believe that right now what U.S. need to do is to focus on containing China, which means it could not afford to spread itself out in places like Middle East and in places like Afghanistan. So there are different battles going on among different U.S. agencies and in the kind of the bureaucratic fight. That's kind of what we see in the media as well. But I don't think U.S. is necessarily this is kind of the high water mark of U.S. imperialism of today. Of course, U.S. is being increasingly challenged in a multipolar world, with China, Russia, Iran, and other world powers. But U.S. is not going to give up without a fight. That's why there's a lot of talks in the media talking about our credibility is at stake, right? And so we live in interesting times. That's all I can say.
We do live in interesting times. Man, that's so interesting. Bryan Mcdonald made the point that the Taliban gave certain assurances to Russia in regards to, no attacks on Tajikistan or no expansion. Have there been any promises or guarantees made to any of the Chinese diplomats that have been in these kind of talks with the Taliban recently?
That's interesting because the one thing that China really want is have Taliban promise not to continue to giving aid to the East Turkestan Islamic movement, aka the Turkestan Islamic Party, the Uyghur jihadist outfit. And so far, Taliban has been pretty tight with Al Qaeda and with Al Qaeda affiliate like the ETIM. But on the other hand, what we have seen is there haven't been any direct attacks launched from the soil of Afghanistan into, say, China's Xinjiang region. Instead, since 2012, we see Uyghur militants getting redeployed from Afghanistan into Syria. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's some kind of secret agreement between the Taliban and the Chinese government where they promise, like, look, we will host these Uyghur fighters, but we will make sure they don't cross the border into Xinjiang. They may go elsewhere like Syria, but we'll make sure they don't go to Xinjiang. I wouldn't be surprised if there's some kind of tacit agreement like that.
Following up on that, this gets to the whole thing about, governance. That regardless of these guys being ideological actors, meaning the Taliban, they still have to deal with an economy. They still have to deal with due diligence in regards to some level of governance of what seems to be a country at this point. The U.S. has been talking about sanctions, and I'm not sure about the Western allies, but there's been talk about sanctions. Well, this seems to be a worst case in regards to them taking control and the downward effects that it would have on the population of Afghanistan. I would imagine, or does China believe, or does Beijing believe that the Taliban will need certain things, meaning either resources, trade, or some kind of relationship, and that brings a certain degree of leverage against the Taliban government? If that question makes sense.
Yeah, totally. I think China is banking on the desire on the side of Taliban to go legit. There is a certain craving for international recognition among the Taliban side to be recognized as a legitimate government of Afghanistan. Back before 2001, there's only a very small number of countries, a handful, in fact, only Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, I believe, recognize Taliban as a legitimate government. So that is one kind of carrot that China could hold out as, to make sure Taliban on their best behavior in regards to China.
That makes perfect sense. All right. Another side of this. Russia and China effectively working together, that's the side, is that you have this developing Eurasian bloc. Right now that is the state. Anything that you could see disrupting that either party should be cautious of, as the United States is now withdrawn, and the U.S. is moving into abeyance. In other words, a couple of decades from now, if the U.S. is in third place, I'm not sure if that's going to be the case, but regardless, if the U.S. has gotten a bit more insular, which it seems we're heading towards anyway, a bit more isolationist, developing conflicts between Russia and China is just an opportunity to examine them. Carl.
I don't think, I think that's far in the future. I mean, I don't see realistically U.S. imperialism retrench from, say, the border of Europe and the East Asia. I mean, right now, the nature of NATO bureaucracy means there's a lot of at stake. Jobs are at stakes here for a lot of these NATO bureaucrats, all these think tankers. All these national security people, they need confrontation with Russia. And that is why, even though there have been voices like Henry Kissinger, talking about maybe we need to, ease up on Russia, maybe even ally with Russia to contain China, but that never happened because, it's a turf fight, right? People in NATO have to protect their territory, which to justify its existence, they have to have confrontation with Russia. And on the other side, the people from U.S. Navy, they very much like to increase tensions in South China Sea and over Taiwan Strait, because that's how their grift is being buttered. So I see U.S. being increasingly, the U.S. politics is increasingly dysfunctional. I don't see this kind of entanglement get ever resolved in the immediate future. So what we'll see is basically the current U.S. policy carrying on forward into foreseeable future, which is simultaneously antagonizing China, Russia, and Iran. And in other words, U.S. importance on the Eurasian landmass will probably continue to decrease over time. It will.
I can totally see that. And I agree with you that in Europe, for the time being, we're still the most relevant outside party there, I would argue. And there's a long history of that. The Marshall Plan isn't the end of it. We've talked before about how the militaries of the various member states of the European Union, which of course shows signs of fragmentation, are sort of set up against each other in some way. Here's what I mean. They each have only a specialized military force. In other words, in order to operate as a military, they need to unify across the European Union. They need to work with other member states, which I get that. It's supposed to diminish conflict within the bloc, but it leaves them starkly dependent on the United States. And that is a sign that you're right and that this will persist for the time being, that they will still be dependent on us. But I'm reminded of the Soviet Union and the fact that it fell a lot more quickly than outside sources thought. And what I could see happening here is the very fact that there's going to be developing uncertainty about what countries are going to do the next time we have a major international incident that sort of aligns these two sides against each other along whatever fault line comes up. the very fact that there's uncertainty about where these other countries might fall, that this whole thing has happened, I think you see what I'm saying. It's a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy that uncertainty tends to undo the bonds that have tied these nations together. Another side of this, and you can feel free to comment on that, but I'm also just pivoting too. People have been speculating that China would now decide to get involved in Afghanistan. I think optimistically on the Western side, because after all, the graveyard of empires is what some have referred to Afghanistan as. And so a lot of Western mil-int pundits are speculating that might be the next step for China. Any prospect of that, Carl?
China definitely not going to launch an invasion of Afghanistan a la U.S. because that just doesn't make sense. All China wants to do is to have a stable Afghanistan, and even if that means Taliban take over, I think China will live with that. And what China want is just stability, and so it will provide a conducive environment for investment and doing business. And that is very drastically different model from the U.S. model. I mean, and there's a lot of in the English language medias, there have been a lot of launching tarball at the Belt and Road Initiative because it really is a fundamentally different model, and it threatens the kind of the U.S. narrative that the world needs us, needs the U.S. military station all over the world. And that we will see how it plays out, but I very much doubt that China will get involved militarily inside Afghanistan. I mean, just look at other neighbors of China, like other trouble spots, like even places like Myanmar. China is not directly militarily, did not deploy military troops inside Myanmar, even though that also another country that's on China's border and very much have strategic importance to China.
Arguably far more important. I'm sorry for cutting in there, but arguably far more important because as we've talked about with you in the past, the Belt and Road, they don't want to just have the South China Sea as their main line of export. They want to have other trade routes. And so passing through Myanmar, skipping over that entire region makes perfect sense. Jamarl, you were coming in.
Well, yeah, I was just going to ask, from Beijing's standpoint, from its foreign policy standpoint, how does it frame all of this? I mean, we've discussed it as kind of a canary in the coal mine, and I think last week we were talking about the UK, the Suez Canal, and how the United States kind of took this dominance in world leadership as a result, basically it was the thing that got across the turn of the worm, or that something has changed in the world. How does China, or let's say, the people who are the foreign policy point of view in China, in general, doesn't necessarily have to be everybody. It's not going to be everybody. But how do they frame this particular event, the fall of Afghanistan, 20 years of nation building that basically ended up being an utter and complete waste, not to mention the lying associated with the nation building as it was taking place? How do they frame this?
Oh, I mean, China very much love to rub it in U.S. face because this is something that, even though China is very friendly with the previous Afghan government, but China has very clearly framed a U.S. occupation of Afghanistan as U.S. overextending itself and another act of U.S. imperialism on the border of China. So, as for framing, I think both the Chinese government and even among the Chinese broader Chinese populace, there's this bit of a glee at the kind of the fiasco that U.S. created for itself in Afghanistan.
Makes perfect sense. I'm going to close this out here. Carl, great talking with you. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
Carl Jha, for those listening, is the host of the Silk and Steel podcast that's focused on China and surrounding regions and their history, culture, and politics. Follow Carl on Twitter at Carl Jha. That's spelled CarlZha. Also follow the podcast on Twitter at SteelSilkN. And subscribe to support the podcast at patreon.com/silkandsteel. When we come back, we're taking your calls. 202-521-1320 is the phone number. Again, that's 202-521-1320. Be right back on the other side of this short break.
Fault lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
What do we want?
News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune into Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. No surrender.
Fault lines.
And we're back, and we're taking your calls. 202-521-1320 is the phone number. You're listening to Fault Lines, and we've got callers on the line. But again, 202-521-1320. Let's go to Tarif, calling in from New Orleans. Tarif, how are you doing?
How y'all doing, man? I have two comments this morning. One comment is dealing with if I write, just say if I'm kind of, creative, right? If I write a story about this journalist named Terry, right? And he's so upset what's going on in the black community, he confronts this group of people in the black community called Press Henry Lodges, right? Masons, the Press Henry Lodges.
Wait, this is a local thing you're talking about in New Orleans, Tarif?
No, yeah, I'm just talking about like if I was going to write a movie, being creative, but yet the Press Henry Lodges it used to help out the black community, but all of a sudden they got involved with the D state, right? And regimes changes around the world, and also COINTELPRO, MK Ultra back home. So let's say just say the journalist whose name would be Terry got a hold of information, and now is going to release it on them if they don't start working with the deep state.
But wait, who?
Right?
So you're describing a movie that you're thinking up, or some kind of like narrative fiction that you're thinking of writing up on this one. But who are you're saying of Press Henry Lodges? Are these real entities? Because I wasn't finding them.
No, I'm just saying no. I'm just saying I'm just making it out the air right now.
Okay, wait, Tariq. Interesting comment. Did you have anything else today, Tariq?
Wait, hold on, man. What happened in Israel? Not Israel. What you call it? Syria. Syria, when they had 22 of the 24 missiles shot down. So the U.S. government, the Russian military is sending Israel veil warning, saying that if they keep on shooting missiles down, keep on firing missiles at Syria, then they're going to wind up shooting airplanes down too, because they need contractors and construction workers to go to Syria and tourists too to rebuild Syria, to fix it up. So I think what Alex Mercouris said, it was a veil warning of if they keep on messing with Syria, they're going to wind up shooting down planes. They're going to allow the Syrian army to shoot down planes. Can I finish with my little story? You don't mind?
I don't know, Jamarl. What do you think?
I don't know where you were going with the story. I don't know where you were going with the story, Tarif.
Here's the thing, Tarif. I don't know, man. I wouldn't do this kind of thing if I were calling into a show. I appreciate your calling. You give us good facts, but literally everybody else is telling me no. Cut this off. And so I'm sorry, Tarif. Interesting point on Syria and Israel. I need to look into that. Speaking of Alexander Mercouris, it's been a little while since we've gotten him on. Nothing personal as far as I can tell. He's just having problems. There's like a medical something going on with his wife. We were talking about with Garland a little while back. Anyway, we're taking your calls, 202-521-1320. Michael, calling in from Sydney. You're on. What's going on?
Yeah, just quickly, I think Tyree's talking about Julian Assange. So I noticed he didn't say free Julian Assange today. Something I noticed. On Afghanistan and what's going on, I think everyone's talking about maybe Turkey being a bit of a disruptor as well. Turkey is basically reliant upon China financially at the moment and through the Belt and Road, and also to prop up the lira and provide funding to Turkey. They're also increasingly becoming reliant on Russia in the region to maintain any type of relevance in the region, independent of NATO, which everyone wants to sort of do. And then also on Afghanistan, China has also signed contracts or was negotiating. Only 20% of Afghanistan has access to electricity on sort of a permanent basis, and that's basically Kabul. The rest of the country has no access to reliable electricity supplies. So obviously, if you won't have any chance of developing as a modern country, you need electricity. It's one of the key things. One thing China does really well, even in very steep terrain and mountainous valleys and everything, is build roads and electricity grids and stuff like that. They've designed all over China. China's also a very mountainous country with a similar geography to Afghanistan in some areas, particularly in Xinjiang, where they've done that quite effectively. And just on Taiwan, I've been hearing stuff from some people I know about there maybe being the military talking about some of the pushback against Taiwan, and maybe even some of like attempted coup or something. From this one I've heard, I don't know how true it is, but I've just heard off a couple of people.
Interesting.
They're not happy about basically the fact that she's putting the country in danger of basically being in a war with China, and they want to avoid that. And possibly the Kuomintang might be behind some of the military counter sort of revolution against Taiwan.
To throw them to China, is the speculation basically?
Well, basically to ensure a smooth transition back to reunification.
Yeah.
Even though the Kuomintang is a traditional enemy of China, like from the Martial Revolution, they've actually been sort of the more moderate in approaching reunification with China as opposed to the current government. Yeah.
I don't know. Well, okay, so again, speculation, like you set it up. You set it up as a kind of a rumor going around. Yeah. Who would in this rumor? Who's trying to convince her to step down? Who would be trying to get Tsai Ing-wen, the president of Taiwan, to step down to speedily expedite the ownership, transfer of ownership of Taiwan to China? Michael.
Well, I just heard basically by 2028, reunification will take place with China on pretty much a similar basis to what happened in Hong Kong, and pretty much it'll be the military behind the scenes basically asking her to step down.
Michael, what I would say is about the Afghanistan one. I do think that the needs of the Taliban are probably going to bring on some level of leverage against the Taliban. You made the point yourself from the standpoint of energy needs or power consumption. If there's a situation where some of the Western countries are using sanctions in order to try to, damage the country, well, if you're the Taliban and you're taking power, you have all sorts of concerns that you have to deal with that might not necessarily have been there the first iteration of things. And, that's where all of this gets really, really interesting. That's why it's really good to bring somebody on from the Russia's desk and that can represent China's interest in this, just to get an idea on what is this country on some level going to look like based on the allegiances that are created, or let's say the foreign policy entanglements that are created based on needs of both. Meaning China wants to be open for business and they want a stable government by which to do so. Which means that if the Taliban wants to have some kind of agreement or some kind of deals, that stable government on some level is going to have to be part of the process. Same thing with Russia. And so I am, there's no way to know, right? This is one of those things where we're just looking, it's kind of prognostication. But I would not necessarily be shocked if it is somewhat of a more stable government the second time around than it was the first time around. But you never know. It's unclear at this point. Michael, any other comments?
No. Yeah, basically you're right. And it gets down to the level of even maintaining the grid in Kabul, the one grid they do have, you need engineers, you need electricians, you need people with education, basically to maintain even the computer systems they may have or whatever. Anything they may have, even that runs on electricity, they need educated people there to maintain them, let alone expand and build them. And having any kind of a modern economy, you need access to the internet, you need access to electricity, running water, things like that. So, yeah, there's all types of things they're relying on external countries to possibly provide that they can't do. Even the teachers to teach people how to become electricians and stuff like that, they're currently American or European or whatever. So,
and to think that America could have done that if we'd had the right leadership, the right whatever. In Afghanistan, building up the country, we built some infrastructure for sure, but even the mining deal, I was on the backstory last week, with John, and we were talking about it. And Lee, who is sick, actually, my dad, host of the show, he called in and he was like, why didn't the U.S. just do the $1 trillion lithium mining deal? Why didn't we decide to invest? Why didn't we decide to set up this relationship going forward? That would be a decent move, but that's not our mode. Our mode is to create these international organizations like the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank, for instance, either create them or simply support them. And then hands off, they do that kind of thing. We don't do the direct investment. Instead, we decide to directly invade countries. China, not so much of the invasion. Instead, they're doing the direct investment. They don't create international intermediaries. They just do direct relationships, which seems, I don't know, a bit more
practical.
Practical, yeah, that's a good word for it. But but the other thing here, Michael, you were talking about, again, it was a rumor. From everything that I'm seeing, the United States is pivoting back to Asia. They're pivoting ever more fully to China. And I'm guessing that they're giving the Taiwanese government, assuming that that's right, as many assurances as they possibly can that, hey, we're going to back you up. We're going to be there for you guys. Because, of course, Taiwan is one of the main planks in contesting China's influence and its growth, simply. You see what I'm saying, Jamarl?
Yeah.
So I don't see why, in other words, we would be telling her, we got your back. So I don't see why she would be deciding to step down.
Right. Well, that's the other interesting part. I saw some people making this kind of depiction of Taiwan and comparing it with Afghanistan, basically saying, hey, the U.S. pulled out of Taiwan. I'm sorry, the U.S. pulled out of Afghanistan. Taiwan, here's looking at you. That type of stuff, saying that they were going to not have support when support was needed. The thing is, though, I don't know what they expect the U.S. to do under a situation where Taiwan, anyway, like back during, what is his name? Ellsberg. Daniel Ellsberg released information the other week, or a few months ago, basically showing that early on, we were thinking about using nuclear weapons as a deterrence to protect Taiwan in case there was an attack by China. And it's like, when you think about it, you're like, oh my God, is that what we're really thinking about doing? Well, yeah, that was some of the war plans. And, Ellsberg making the point of like, okay, what are the plans today? And are there plans today? And is there even any sensible, sane plan of preventing China from taking Taiwan if China decides it wants to take Taiwan? And I don't know what that sane plan would be. So, it's, support, yes. But part of the reason we're there, though, is to keep China in the barn. And I got to be honest, I think that horse is out the barn.
Horse is out the barn, yeah. That's the thing. Well, and this is, of course, that's the other side of it. Last week, I don't think we were focusing on China, really. Because really, the way I see it right now is that you have this sort of Russian-Chinese bloc where they're somewhat dependent on each other.
Yeah, they're working together.
Seem to act in unanimity or whatever on a lot of these things, specifically when it comes to any grounds on which they oppose the United States. And that's why I wanted to get into that with Carl. Like, are there fault lines that we might not see yet, so to speak, fault lines, that we should be aware of sort of before they come up? Sounds like he doesn't think there are, at least if there are, they're so far in the future that it's just not worth thinking about right now. But we were talking about the international community fading, but really it's China ascending.
Yeah.
Because, as we fall, what's the other party that's rising? You've got to have some displacement here. You know what I mean?
And it does seem like Europe, the West, has tied their lot to us. Meaning, however we go in this, they're going with us. And so, that's
for
what
now. But with Nord Stream 2 with Russia and with and China, major investment deals across the European Union. For now, that's the thing. And that's where, like, when he was saying it's going to be, I don't know that he said exactly this, but decades in the future, basically, that the United States is still a power. Sure, our influence in Eurasia is waning, but we're still a big power. I could see that falling apart a lot faster than people might think, because so much of the strength is built on contingencies that are getting less and less certain. In other words, our relationships with our European allies, that's one of them. The stability of our currency, which is backed up in this fiat exchange rate system by other countries' confidence in us and by our ability to enact military force overseas. These things tying together economically, diplomatically, and of course militarily on the other side of both of those, I could see things getting frayed and falling apart at their seams much more quickly in a sort of sliding, cascading feedback sense. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But we'll see what actually happens. We've got to close this hour out. We're going to be coming back in a minute with headlines and the last hour of this morning show. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be right back.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America. Oh my gosh, Jamarl, I'm sorry, I threw myself off right from the beginning. Live from across these divided states of America, it is time now for the last hour this morning of the most disruptive show, covering news, politics, and events from across these disunited states we call America and the increasingly divided surface of our globe. Your independent political analyst, I am Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the last man on the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together, that means you're surely listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
That was my fault.
I don't know that was your fault. We got into an interesting conversation that I'll be coming back to in a couple of minutes here after headlines, I think, about the story from Michael Tracy over on Substack, the publishing platform. Journalist Michael Tracy, of course, a lot of folks know him. He's looking at the propaganda over Afghanistan, really is looking at corruption, and we'll come back to it, crazy, horrible, insane stuff.
Because this point is like, you guys are flipping out over Biden now, as opposed to the 20 years where they've been lying and this radical corruption and everything else that's been going on. His thing is the issue, yes, how we left, but more so while we were there. His thing is that's the issue.
Yes.
Very interesting.
Absolutely. But, you know what? Without further ado, let's get into the headlines. First up, in COVID news, we have, as of yesterday, 79,391 new COVID cases reported in the United States. There were also about 185 new deaths yesterday. Over the past week, there have been an average of about 149,000, really call it 150,000 cases per day. That's an increase of 36% from the average 2 weeks earlier. 51% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated at this point, and 60% of residents have received at least one dose of a COVID vaccine. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected about 37,778,000 people across the United States. It has killed 628,285 people. Taiwan, about which we were just talking, has begun distributing its first locally produced vaccine. That's despite concerns that the vaccine was approved before undergoing phase 3 clinical trials. Taiwan's president, by the way, took the jab live on social media. We were just talking about her, too. China has reported no new local cases today. This brings to an end the recent small wave of infections in the city of Nanjing. America, meanwhile, is amidst its fourth wave of coronavirus, and a new poll enacted by USA Today and Ipsos shows that an overwhelming majority of citizens are for strict rules and mask mandates to curtail the virus. 72% stated a mask mandate was a matter of health and safety, and 61% supported requiring the vaccine except for those with medical or religious exemptions. When asked specifically, 70% agreed that people had the right to choose not to get the vaccine, but that they then do not have the right to be around vaccinated people. In national news, track star Sha'Carri Richardson came in last place in her first race since being suspended for an illegal substance just before the Olympics. Jamaica winner Elaine Thompson-Herah, meanwhile, clocked 10.54 seconds. 10.54 seconds in the 100-meter race, which makes her good for the second fastest women's time in history, which, as I have to say, that's a big deal. That's a bigger deal than Sha'Carri Richardson failing, although, of course, she has the name recognition. We were all just talking about her. It makes sense why we're focusing on her, but this other Jamaican woman just got the second best time in history. I don't know. I feel like that deserves some attention, too, so I'm giving it to it. After 1 year into the pandemic, a new study by the medical journal, JAMA, what does it stand for again? The Journal
of American Medical Association.
Thank you. Has found that 2/3 of U.S. children's calorie intake comes from ultra-processed or ready-to-eat food. This includes foods like frozen pizzas, chips, and cookies. 1 in 3 pediatric patients was above their expected weight. That's a 41% increase from pre-pandemic data. In international news, the Taliban have said they will not extend the deadline by which American forces need to leave Afghanistan. They've said that the 31st of August is a red line. A spokesman said that Biden had said troops would be out by that date and that extending it was simply extending Afghanistan's occupation. The German army, meanwhile, has said that a member of Afghanistan's security forces has been killed in a gunfight at Kabul airport, with a statement saying that a number of American and German troops were engaged in the firefight along with the Afghan National Guard. 3 other Afghans were injured. It is unclear right now who started that firefight. Meanwhile, in Ukraine is hosting a diplomatic summit on Crimea today and tomorrow called the Crimea Platform Summit. They've invited almost every nation in the region except for Russia. We were talking about this earlier with Bryan Mcdonald. As you can see, specifically if you look at who the United States is sending, we're sending 2 people. One is the interim charge to affairs at the U.S. Embassy in Kiev, so a local diplomatic person. And the other is exact title escapes me, but Under Assistant Secretary of Affairs for the U.S. Department of Energy, something like that. So like the sort of middle-ranking figure in the Energy Department, not, as Bryan noted, any ambassadors, not even like deputy ambassadors. No, this is our local person and our energy person, which shows the extent of our interest and the nature of it, too. A former Indonesian cabinet minister has been sentenced, meanwhile, to 12 years in prison after a court found him guilty of taking bribes while arranging aid to families affected by the pandemic. Investigators into the former minister discovered 7 suitcases holding more than $1 million in cash. In tech news, top Pentagon officials are reportedly trying to declassify details on anti-satellite weapons technology. Sources say the effort is headed by General John Hyten and was due to be unveiled at the National Space Symposium, which starts today in Colorado Springs and will run until Thursday. PayPal, meanwhile, is bringing cryptocurrency to the United Kingdom. The company is giving the ability to buy, sell, and trade Bitcoin, Ethereum, Litecoin, and Bitcoin Cash, no Dogecoin though, to anyone with the app and their bank account linked. PayPal users will also be able to check out with cryptocurrency instead of cash if desired. And in Earth and Science news, Tropical Storm Henry made landfall yesterday in Rhode Island. The brunt of the storm will be between Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New York, heading now. More than 100,000 power outages have already been reported, and 86 people have been rescued from flooded vehicles. Over 1,000 flights have been canceled due to the storm. Still, New York Governor Andrew Cuomo has deployed 500 National Guard troops and around 1,000 state policemen to assist those affected. And with that, those are our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, quick heads up before we get back into the conversation. There are a couple things I wanted to hit. Austin, I saw your message. I'll invite you into the studio here to come in and talk about this if you're done. We're talking about China and cases and stuff. But also, we're going to be off this next week.
Yes.
I pitched this at the beginning of the show. I want to give folks fair warning every day of the show this week. Both Jamarl and I are going to be taking all of next week off, which means Fault Lines for that week will not exist. We'll just be off. And then I'm personally going to be taking the extra week off, too. I'm going to be biking around the Pacific Northwest with my brother and seeing family I haven't seen in years. Really missed them. Anyway, that's happening. We're both taking next week off. I'll be warning you again throughout the week. But be forewarned, you'll have to find some other morning talk show or something else to do during the morning. Anyway, Austin Pelly, producer for the show, joining us in the studio now. Austin, we're talking about the China saying that they've cut out all cases, basically, after this recent wave that they say hit them. And you're saying you don't buy it.
No, not at all. Do you?
They've gotten all cases out?
I do.
China has zero cases.
0 new cases?
Yeah.
I don't have any reason not to buy it. Is there something?
Because they're trying to curve the narrative that they started a global pandemic and that if they're doing better than the rest of the world, then it shows that, like, hey, we're not all bad. We're doing something good, too. You should mimic us.
Well, what do you have to show for it? I mean, it's not about how you feel. It's about what's there.
Yeah, I mean, I was just looking at the story here.
It's improbable.
China has a massive, massive population, and you're telling me that they have 0 new cases, and we're averaging 150,000 a day.
Well, just so we're clear, I'm saying I don't know. I don't have anything pushed one way or the other, but I do get where you're coming from. But we were the epicenter for a long time. I mean, we had like 5,000 people dying a day at one point. So I don't know. I mean, is it possible that they're trying to control the narrative? Maybe. But there's nothing that I have to make me think that the numbers are obscene, even if the numbers are few. And also keep in mind, it's probably the numbers that they're talking about recording, less about whether it's there in fact, if that makes sense.
Well, I think that the U.S. is so fast to use a COVID as a COVID-related death. Like they're so fast to assign it to a whole bunch of other deaths as well. Yeah. Not to take away from the numbers, maybe those people wouldn't have died, but they already had some pre-existing conditions.
Yeah.
But I think we bolster the numbers. We use it as a political tool against America. So that way the left can fight with the right, and we can like both push our own agendas. Like that's what America uses it for. I think other countries, namely China, uses it as a political tool against other nations.
The only catch is, though, we cut the numbers. And May 1st, the CDC stopped recording breakthrough cases of COVID that were not going into the hospital or that weren't basically dying. And so basically the numbers of what they were, let's say, as it was going forward, are now less than what they were in actual fact reality. So it's like, this is ProPublica piece. I can even get a name of it. It's called the CDC. Where is it? If I can get my computer to work correctly, because at the moment that here it is. The CDC only tracks a fraction of breakthrough COVID-19 infections, even as cases surge. The May 1st decision by the CDC only to track breakthrough infections that lead to hospitalizations or death has left the nation in a muddled understanding of COVID's impact on the vaccinated. Meaning, the notion of keeping the numbers down, it's not just China. If indeed it's China, it's also us. Meaning it's a political weapon from the standpoint of the Biden administration.
But we don't need it as much now that Biden won the election.
Is that true?
We don't need it as much. I mean,
no,
Republicans, right-wingers can moan all they want, but I mean, he's not going out. He's not going anywhere.
See, I think it's the opposite because I think Biden's administration is in this, and I'm shocked you're giving him a pass on this. The administration, for the most part, is in this situation where if the numbers start to go up, this is something that Biden would look like he's utterly failed on. And if you remember, Biden's thing was supposed to be, I'm going to handle the vaccines, the people are going to get vaccinated, I'm going to pass the infrastructure bill, and we're going to go running in the sun to the next election, and that's not what's happening.
It doesn't matter if the numbers go up for Biden, because if the numbers go down, look at me, I did a great job. If the numbers go up, look at what Trump handed me.
No. You can't blame Trump on this one.
That's what I'm saying. I'm not saying it's right, but he's going to make that narrative anyway.
But I don't think that's going to work.
Yeah, I don't think that's going to work.
I mean, even before Afghanistan, I think you could have said that wouldn't work. But after Afghanistan, it's very clear. The media has now taken a turn. It's not like they're against Biden, but it's like they've shown their fangs a bit, and I just don't see that happening. But I mean, two things here. You're saying that the reporting on the numbers was driven in order to basically incite culture war, to make that thing happen for political purposes to get Biden elected, and I get that point. Maybe there's an element to that. But it seems first to me that it's reaction, overreaction, whatever. It makes sense that some of the, if you die with COVID-19, a doctor is going to, at the very least, want to take note of that somewhere. And the idea that that's going to be your cause of death, admittedly controversial, but it still makes sense from an epidemiological standpoint to accurately track who died with this vaccine. And I don't think you're seriously pushing back against the idea. But
a COVID-related death, I like to bring this example up because when I've gotten tested multiple times over the course of the pandemic, never one positive, but gotten tested. If you're standing in a line to get tested in a bad neighborhood and there's a drive-by shooting, that's a COVID-related death. Yeah.
Is that true?
That is true. It is a COVID-related death.
If you get hit,
those are the numbers that we're using. That's what the media uses.
Well, real quick,
I don't
because it's COVID-related.
Where are you saying that?
I need to see that.
Where do you get that?
I had seen it when I was looking, when I was in line. I turned to my roommate. I said, I wonder like how accurate this COVID-related death is. I went home and I looked it up. I'll have to find the article for you guys, but
I want to see the article
because this happened a few months ago.
I want to see the article because that is truly ridiculous, and if that's true, then that should be worth.
And I don't think that's a majority. I don't think that's a majority by any means. But I'm saying it helps bolster numbers.
I want to get back to China for a second though, because we've only got a couple minutes left, and we turned away from that. That was what got us onto this. Here's why I don't know, but I kind of can buy it. We like to talk in America about how they're all totalitarian, right? We like to talk about how they're authoritarian and they've got control of their population. They're constantly trying to influence them. Then we also, if you look at South Korea, Japan, Singapore, Taiwan, even go as far as New Zealand, all of these countries in their different ways have successfully dealt with the coronavirus. Maybe they've had it come back, but none of them had anything near the level of cases, infections, or deaths, most critically, the increased level of deaths we had in this country.
They're also so much smaller. They didn't enforce like a child cap because their population was growing way beyond the size of their economy and their geography. Like China is massive.
It is massive, but here's the thing. They're authoritarian. And if they're combining effectively all of the policies that they see, if they're doing test and trace, if they're shutting down their borders, if they're creating local quarantines within cities, if they're installing apps on people's phones
so
that they can self-report them.
City or something, right? I mean, like they were tracing everybody within a city. Like some of that stuff was really extreme.
Wuhan, they were forcing vaccines, I think, right? Or was it
definitely testing.
Forced testing?
Yeah, it's definitely testing.
It was forced testing.
Yeah.
In Wuhan. I'm saying like, yes, with an authoritarian government, you can get away with that. Right?
I think that kind of thing actually does work.
And it does work, and people are going to be complaining about it. But with the population size that massive, how many of them are homeless?
Some percentage.
How many of them are homeless that you don't even know that aren't going to get tested? How many of them don't have phones that you can track and see and make sure they've got a vaccine or have been tested?
I don't know, but my point is, taking that stuff into account, I don't know what the facts are. You might be right. There might be some lingering number of cases, but the overall narrative that China has effectively managed to wipe this out through maybe heavy-handed, maybe proportional behavior makes sense to me.
Exactly what it is. It's a narrative.
Well, it's a narrative, but narratives can be right or they can be wrong. Do you think this one's wrong?
I think narratives are, they just play into whoever's telling the story, really. Their agenda.
It's true, but I don't have an exact.
Do I think this one's
here.
right or wrong? I think that the fact that China says they have 0 new cases is wrong. I don't have stats to prove it, but statistically, it wouldn't make
so
sense.
Average. It has to be one guy.
It
has to be one guy somewhere.
You're saying, well, but here's
I barely believe it when you have countries like New Zealand saying that.
Okay, but do you buy the narrative that they sent out a bunch of tests, they got a lot of people tested, and they saw no new positive tests? And maybe there are some people who slipped through the cracks. At a certain point, it's like, what do you think about what happened? But my point is, I think that overall, the narrative gets the message across. Whether there are zero new cases, which I don't know.
Or 100 out of 1.3 billion people.
Exactly. That's the thing. That's the thing. I do buy the narrative that overall, they have successfully managed to quell this virus.
So, no.
Locally, within the borders of their own country.
I mean, can you really like make sure that the wet markets are fine now? Like that there's no one in there that could be spreading it, that anything like that?
No, of course not. No, of course not.
So, I mean, and also the government sent out 1.3 billion tests.
Oh, I have no idea.
Like that, it's just not. I don't see it as feasible, especially in such a short amount of time.
No, but you wouldn't need to do an entire cross-population thing. You're just monitoring for local cases, and then you're like, okay, who would those people have come into contact with? You do sort of network analysis.
Are you going door to door, or are you waiting for them to come to City Hall? Because a lot of people aren't going to go to City Hall.
I'm pretty sure that they're going door to door. A lot of this is based on what they were doing during the early days in Wuhan.
And if somebody's sick, I would imagine they're going to the hospital. I mean, this is kind of like the Trump stuff where he was like, oh, no, we're just seeing because we're doing more testing. And it's like, no, dude, the people... Just because you're doing more testing doesn't mean more people are going to end up in the hospital, or just because more people are going to get sick or die.
More sick,
and if they're not seeing
some people have to go into work to just put food on the table. Some people can't afford to go into the hospital. You know that.
I don't know that. You mean in the United States or in China?
No, I mean in general.
No, in China, if you need to go to the hospital, you can go to the hospital.
Yeah, in the United States, that's the thing. We do have some uniquely screwed up systems, effed up systems. Healthcare is one of them. There's some upsides to it, but
I'm not even talking about healthcare. I'm just talking about one day in the hospital is one less day of income.
I do understand that. But if you're talking about, you're trying to make a point of saying there has to be at least one case. And I think my thing is, even if there's 1,000 cases out of 1.5 million people or billion people, that is still an amazing level of management, considering we just lost 1,700 people on Friday. It's that. I don't expect all of it to be...
I do know we need to close
Let's
this.
Close it. Let's close it. I keep pushing. Austin, thank you for joining us in the studio. I like the pushback. I always appreciate it.
I wish I had time to prepare on this. I'd come with some numbers.
No.
Oh, dude, no. Anytime you have something to say, the rule is up to this point, it's like one of the producers like, hey, I want to say something.
And same with you, Cordell.
Get out here.
And Saul, interim engineer. If you want to leave the board, feel free to come in here. But anyway, we've got to close this segment out. We'll be coming back with Ted Rall in just a minute. Ted Rall, political cartoonist, syndicated columnist. We're going to be getting back into this conversation that was shortened last week. We're talking about Rall's travels through Afghanistan. We're talking cultural matters. Just an interesting conversation we're going to be getting back into.
Yeah.
And again, you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, going into a break, coming right back with Ted. Be right back.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold. By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us. From mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality, to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black Lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, and I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind. Color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik. Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps make the show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. And we had a great conversation last week with Ted Rall, and I really wanted to finish that, or we wanted to finish that conversation with Ted, just because it was utterly and entirely fascinating to have a discussion about his travels through Afghanistan during the time of the surge, during the time when Taliban was in charge. And if I'm not mistaken, there was another time period in which he was traveling after. All fascinating, all personal experience. And considering that Afghanistan has just fallen, considering the Taliban has just taken power again, there are questions about what came before and whether or not what came before would give some kind of context to what's going to come on version 2.0. So to discuss, we're joined with Ted Rall. Ted Rall is a political cartoonist and syndicated columnist. You can follow Ted on Twitter at Ted Rall and read his cartoons and articles at rawl.com. Ted, thank you for joining us again.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So last time you were here, we were having a conversation about when you went the first time around when the Taliban was in power. And you were making a point that it looked like it was basically the Stone Age. There had been multiple wars. You had a situation where there was no currency, from roads weren't paved. That you basically had a huge or large segment of the population, particularly men, that had basically died from the wars and the fighting. And you leave something like that to where you go to like 2010 with Obama, who's at this point doing a surge. And within the context of that surge, we now know, of course, that did not necessarily work. I was reading this stuff, Michael Tracy, it was the article that Shane mentioned earlier, and some of the things that John, Safko, I believe the gentleman's name was, he is the person, Inspector General, Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, John Safko. This was the gentleman who they relied on for the Afghan papers when they were going into some of the things that were taking place. Some of the things that he mentioned are astonishing. Right here, for example, we heard horrible stories about the widows of Afghan soldiers who had to give sexual favors in order to get pension benefits. Horrendous. You have other stuff. It says they would also, and this is again, the Afghan army, who they wanted to basically stand there and fight. You have other stories where they're going into saying that you're trying to win the hearts and minds of the various security forces, and you can't necessarily do that because of issues of corruption. Even going so far as to say that they were teaching, like they were looking at shows like Cops or NCIS in order to figure out how to train the staff for police duties in the country. This seems to have, this was horrendous, to put it mildly. From your take, just from being there once before in the population itself, this would have a cancerous effect on trying to get anything legitimate accomplished in a country over the course of time that you're in the country. And how would the civilian population, and yes, I get this is somewhat of an open question, but how would the civilian population engage something like that?
Well, Jeff Bezos from Amazon used to say that his mantra when he was starting out was to under-promise, over-deliver. He would tell you, hey, you're going to get your package in 4 days, but he knew he could get it to you in 2, knowing that you would be psyched when it appeared in 2. That's exactly what's the opposite of what the U.S. did in Afghanistan. The expectations were sky high, and part of the problem was that Afghans saw the United States as spectacularly wealthy compared to them and infinitely powerful compared to them. And they literally thought that we were going to show up in the fall of 2001 and open a big box and build them a brand new country from the ground up and then be on our way like Santa Claus. And, I remember talking to people about their desires and expectations in November and December of 2001. And they all said, the same thing. They wanted infrastructure more than anything else. I mean, Afghanistan is first and foremost an economy based on trade. It is at a crossroads on the Silk Road. It is an intersection between Iran and goods are manufactured in Pakistan, transported across Afghanistan, sold in Iran, and in the former Soviet republics like Uzbekistan. They wanted roads, and they wanted to be able to travel safely. They wanted electricity. They wanted phones. Beyond that, they didn't really have a lot of expectations, but they wanted those things, and they wanted them immediately. They didn't really care about elections. They didn't really care about, democracy. They didn't really care about schools, although that's nice. They really wanted that infrastructure to happen, and it didn't. I remember, talking to Afghans and telling them, like, look, what you're expecting is unrealistic. The United States government is bureaucratic. The Congress is slow and dysfunctional. There's, it's just going to be hard. You're not going to get this stuff very quickly. And in fact, by 2004, there had not yet been 2 bricks put together throughout the entire country. According to the New York Times, and certainly I saw the same thing, there was not a single reconstruction project that had been funded by the United States that had so much as built a single house, but 3 years in. And I think the war was lost in those first few years when we failed. We didn't pave any roads. We didn't build electricity. Nothing was different. People's lives didn't improve at all. And we did ultimately, by 2010, when I went the third time, we had built a lot. Things were pretty impressive, but by then it was too little too late for a lot of Afghans. I mean, I'm simplifying because we only have a few minutes, but that's kind of the executive summary. The expectations were sky high, stratospheric, and simple and straightforward, and we didn't meet them.
Could we have?
Well, that's a good question. I think with proper planning, maybe not. Maybe not given the way our system works. I mean, we would have had to sort of tell Congress, hey, we're going to invade this country that has been suffering through 23 years of civil war, has been completely destroyed, doesn't have a single bridge left standing in it. And we're going to have, to cross a body of water, you had to drive through it. I know, I did. It was like, so I think if we'd gone to Congress and said, hey, okay, we're going to need billions of dollars allocated for immediate reconstruction. We're not going to hire American contractors the American way. We're going to hire local Afghans and Pakistanis and Chinese to cross the border because they're there. And we're just going to get it done quickly. I mean, I'm asking a level of nimbleness that is unrealistic. But, theoretically, is it possible? Sure, but not given the way we are configured.
Yeah.
I'm curious. When you were there in 2010, what was the conversation like? You said when you were there in 2001, people were like, they had all of these expectations of the United States, and then basically, okay, we're building your country down, we're leaving, basically a country in a box. In 2010, when it became clear that that wasn't going to be what happened, what was the population saying then? And one other point to piggyback, a difference between what was taking place in the capital of Kabul and what was taking place outside of the capital, correct?
Well, that's right. That's all the difference in the world. The first question is people were done with us. They were completely done with us. The Karzai regime was so toxic. It was so corrupt. In Kabul, there were all these gaudy new mansions with reflected copper-colored windows all over the place. Those were all corrupt government officials. The cash was coming in literally on pallets from the United States, but the poverty was dreadful. They were completely, expecting and hoping for the Taliban to come back. They were done with us. I mean, they've been done with us for years. I'd say they've been done with us since 2002 or 2003, to be conservative, if not sooner. They have been, what just happened was long overdue, and any Afghan would say was completely inevitable for the last, let's say, 18 plus years. And in terms of the differences between Kabul and the rest of the country, there was a mass migration to Kabul because there was a perception that that was the only place where money was coming in. Certainly there were reconstruction projects in other cities, but it was just, they paled compared to Kabul. Kabul exploded in population. I think it was a city of under 1 million people in 2000, and now it's like 4 or 5 million. It probably just grew a bit due to the internally displaced people who fled the Taliban advance. So it's been a mess, and it's been a mess for a long time, and Americans are just starting to focus on it.
Well, and I want to come back. You were talking about the population of Kabul, but the population of Afghanistan overall has quadrupled in the span of just a couple of decades. And, partly because of the multiple wars, not just the Soviet-Afghan war, but of course the one that we've just finished waging, or are finishing waging maybe. So the population has expanded like crazy. just an interesting sort of, I don't know what that looks like demographically, but you're talking that one thing. The overall population of the country has also expanded quite dramatically. The reason that we got into the war sort of set us up to not do the thing that you were talking about, the infrastructure, the actual nation building, setting up a viable state that wouldn't be, dependent on us for the duration of its existence. Seems like we wanted at least two things. One, to salve the need for bloodlust among Americans at home following 9/11. And two, another convenient money laundering excuse, which is, as I've seen over the weekend, a lot of people have started to turn to that. Basically, all of the money that we're putting into the country, small amounts of which goes towards paying off local public officials, including people as high-ranking as the president, the bulk of which goes towards funding military-industrial complex companies, whether it's Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, et cetera, or all these NGOs that were involved from outside. That's what set us up for the war. And so it's no surprise that the way that we ended it didn't leave the country any better than we found it. Quite the opposite, of course. Ted, pretty close to a break here. Really appreciate you joining us again to talk about this. And I just want to set this up again for folks. Handing over to you for just a couple seconds. We're talking with you about this, not just because you're a knowledgeable and in your own way authoritative person to talk to. You've been through the region multiple times. You've passed through. And so last time we had you on last week, we were talking about more like a cultural angle traveling through there. But just, again, reminding folks, Ted Rall, thank you for joining us. Really good talking with you.
Likewise.
And for those listening, that was Ted Rall, political cartoonist, syndicated columnist. Do go check him out, by the way. Check out his Twitter. That's Ted Rall on Twitter. Also check out his website. That's rall.com, RALL.com. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Coming back, we're talking sports and Sha'Carri Richardson for a few minutes here. Producer Cordell Woodland's joining us. We're talking about also following up on the Olympics, too. Been a few weeks now. We're going to be getting into that as well. Anyway, you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back.
Fault Lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
When the going gets tough, the powerful want propaganda. But we won't let them cancel the facts. Whether you're woke or drowsy, we know that you can handle the truth, and we're giving it to you every morning. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan every Monday through Friday from 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern. Your first stop for sanity in a world gone mad.
We are talking
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give you the most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold. Fault Lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And we are joined in the studio by Cordell Woodland, producer for the show. We're talking about Sha'Carri Richardson, who, as we were talking about in the headlines, sprinter was basically banned from attending the Olympics this year because she tested positive for marijuana, for THC in her system. She didn't attend. That became a subject of some dispute. This was like one of the earlier, in the month leading up to the Olympics. This is one of those stories that came out here in the States specifically. Anyway, this is her most recent race, or this is the race that she's done since all that stuff happened, right?
Yep.
In the recent race, she came in 10th place out of 10 runners. She came in last place. During that same race, by the way, the woman who won it got the second place world record for the fastest, I believe it was 100-meter sprint. But Sha'Carri lost. Any sign of what caused that, Cordell?
The easy answer is rust. A lot of pressure being put on her. I mean, I don't know how many people would have watched this race had Sha'Carri not been in it, and had what happened with her situation leading up to the Olympics. Had that not happened, I don't know how many people would be watching it. So it was a lot of eyes on her. A lot of people wanted to see what she would look like in her first time back on the track since being suspended. And I mean, she came out slow, slow to say the least. And that's not really a level of concern because she starts races slow generally. But she was nowhere near the pack. I mean, she
9
was
out of 9
trailing and from behind from start
way
to finish.
behind. Like I saw the race. It was 100 meters, and I'm looking. I was like, wait, she's 9 out of 9, and not just 9 out of 9, slowly getting compared to everybody else. Everybody else was past, and she's still trying to finish the race. Rust, she's supposed to be an Olympic athlete.
Yeah.
I mean, not to mention, she knew she was going to do this race.
Right.
So whether or not she ran in the Olympics or not seems to be secondary to the point that if you're going to run in a race like this and there's going to be this huge thing about you getting to the Olympics because of a drug test, it looks like just on an average day, you'll be able to not be in ninth place.
You would think so. And by no means am I giving her a pass on this. I have to believe that even though she wasn't in the Olympics, she was still training. Yeah. She's still keeping into shape, still, keeping her daily routine going as if she had a race each weekend. For her to come out that flat, I think a lot of it was mental. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of it was really just she understood the amount of pressure that she put on herself when you look at the last time that she was on the track, and even a lot of the talking that she's done even after the suspension. I mean, she went on one of her rants on Twitter, at least after her suspension, was basically like, people were going to watch this event because they knew I was going to be in it, as if she is the face of the sport and she's the one attracting all the eyes. And she gets out there, and it's a lot of other people that were out there on that track that heard the things that she said. And I'm pretty sure they were licking their chops.
She was saying stuff like, I'm the best one out there.
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of beating her own chest and not calling anybody out specifically, but it was kind of on the level of, well, we all know what it is. We all know I'm the best at this right now because I just proved it in the Olympic trials.
Oh, wow.
And you'll go, people aren't really, she claimed nobody was really going to watch the track and field
if it wasn't for her
events in the Olympics, considering she wasn't going to be in it anymore.
So she's playing herself up, basically.
Yeah, she did. She did do a lot of playing herself up, and I think that's why a lot of people have so much to say. And even after she lost, I mean, she still had plenty to say.
Yeah.
She had plenty to say.
She's still in the race. She's committing to it. Well, she calls herself, I think, the sixth best ever or something.
Sixth best ever.
Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's the time that she set in the Olympic trials. So she did set the sixth best record.
But that's just this year.
Yeah. This year, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so it's like, what happened? Like, because, I don't think you can make the argument of I'm the sixth best ever and then come in ninth place. You have to have some reason for that.
And let's also understand during those trials, that was, to my knowledge, against U.S. racers. She lost this race to Jamaican racers who ended up, I believe
second best in the world or something.
Yeah, one of them did get the second best time in the world, but I believe the three Jamaican racers that were in this race came in the top three for this same race in the Olympics. So she is sixth best in the world with that trial time, but she wasn't going up against the level of talent that she went up against yesterday.
I see. Very interesting.
It is very interesting. All right. Also, Olympics generally. We're a couple weeks after the fact right now. Seems like they went decently. It was a little bit weird, a little bit muted, but just to kind of final retrospective on this one. And then coming up, next event we have, of course, we have the Winter Olympics. Any word of those are planned for next year, right?
Yeah, to my knowledge, they're still supposed to be happening. Nothing has been talked about as far as cancel. I think the last thing they want to do is cancel that.
For sure.
Considering how the last Olympics had to get pushed back. I think they want to try to get, even if that means no fans, nobody there, so be it. But I think they're going to do everything in their power to make sure that they stay on schedule with that.
But were there any kind of super spreader events or anything weird from the standpoint of the Olympic Village by the people who were there? Because I know some of the athletes were being dicey about whether or not they were either getting vaccinated or the testing and everything else. Was there any events, was there anything that extended beyond the Olympics itself from the standpoint of people getting ill?
So I talked to a couple of people that were out there covering the Olympics just to see what the environment was like and how stringent the limitations were, the COVID restrictions and everything were. And everybody said, I mean, it not that there wasn't any type of place that you could go to, kind of find a party scene, but they said they kept it pretty much on wraps out there. They did a pretty good job from what it sounds like with the restrictions. Nobody's really come back saying that they found out that there was some crazy super spreader event that went on. So to my knowledge and from the people I talked to that were out there, it seems like everything was pretty much done well.
Excellent. Good to hear. All right. I think I'm going to close it here.
Yeah.
Actually, Cordell Woodland, thank you for joining us. Quick update talking sports. Really appreciate it.
No problem.
And for everybody else, again, Cordell Woodland, producer for this show. We're going into a break, coming back. taking your calls, 202-521-1320. Also getting into our own conversation. A couple things I wanted to hit. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be right back.
Fault Lines. Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not-so-distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history. This week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, taking your calls, 202-521-1320. Also, I want to talk about this Mike Tracy story. Because like you're talking about, he's basically looking at the Inspector General in Afghanistan who's come out with a report. His work is based on that report. And a couple of things, you mentioned them the last hour, but the one that is not the grisliest, but it's the most ridiculous. The police were watching NCIS and like American crime shows in order to bring themselves up to speed on how to police in Afghanistan. Think about that for a second. It's like you're trying to become a surgeon.
Yeah.
And you're like, I'm going to go watch House or whatever. You know what I mean? That's clearly not the way to do that. What do you think, Jamarl?
No, of course it's not the way to do it. I mean, even this, we heard horrible stories about widows of Afghan soldiers who had to give sexual favors in order to get their pension benefits. And this gets to, what, what's his name was saying, Terrell was saying, like the level of corruption that was so endemic, where it's like just the very basic of things saying, oh, the Afghan military just fell apart. Okay, well, did they fall apart or they didn't have anything to fight for in the way that you guys are framing it? And even this argument about, well, hey, the problem is the withdrawal. Okay, is the problem the withdrawal or the way that the war was prosecuted over the course of the last 20 years and the money that was spent on it? I think one of the things that Raw said that might shock some people is people were ready for the Taliban to come back.
Yeah.
And, if you think about it, could they have won without people being ready for them to come back?
To be clear, some people.
Yeah, some people.
And I think I would even venture to say the majority of people, but that doesn't mean that there's not a
of course,
substantial minority of people who are more aligned with Western values.
That's right.
Who want women to have equal rights to men and not have to wear certain articles of clothing or whatever. You get my point.
And who benefit from the corruption, let's be honest, right? You're going to have a certain segment of the population that is benefiting from the trillions that was dropped into the country. And so, those people with those things bound up in all of this stuff, those people are going to be more inclined to want the West to stay there, despite the fact of corruption, especially if they're prospering from it. They asked one of the Taliban spokesmen, and he basically made the point of saying, look, people aren't scared. It's not that they're scared. It's just they want to live in a richer country. And it's like, yeah, maybe, no, yes, maybe some of that's true, but some of that is also, the contrary is also true.
You're talking about the people fleeing, people trying to leave Afghanistan.
Yeah, I think there might be some people who want to be in a different country or a richer country. That's probably true. But I think you also get a section of the country that knows that they worked as, part of the occupying force. And in their heads, I would imagine that they are probably very freaked out about Taliban taking control. Because honestly, at the point where Taliban takes control, you just have to deal with their word. That's all you got at that point. It's not like the U.S. or somebody else is going to throw troops in order to protect you after that. It is what it is at that point. You have to just go with their assurances.
Yes.
And, many people don't necessarily want to do that, remembering what it was the first time around. And, it's easy to be like, well, this is going to be Taliban 2.0, especially when you're not there and you say that. If you're there and you think your neck is on the line, you may have some qualms about it. But this report by Tracy is really good and disturbing, to put it mildly. And Trace's basic thesis is just there are a lot of people right now who are wringing their hands about us and the way they were leaving, missing the point that the problem was the way that we prosecuted it over the last 20 years. It's a good point.
Well, and so there's also this interesting conversation about withdrawing because people go back and forth on each other. I've seen people responding to other people, but then I don't even know exactly how to explain it. I'll put it like this. Lee, my dad, over on the backstory, he's sort of I've heard him kind of not dismissing, but I've heard that he's been dismissing some of this stuff. But basically, we should have just pulled out.
Right.
It was always going to be this way. I've heard other people say it was always going to be this way. We should have just pulled out.
Yeah.
We need to just get over it. I disagree with that.
Yeah.
But I get why he's saying that, partly because he's responding to all these other people who are like, we need to stay there. We're trying to get us to go back in. And so he's trying to push back against that. But in the process, he's saying things that I technically, you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I know
There's
what you
this
mean.
like responding to responses,
Yeah.
this anticipated kind of thing that complicates the conversation. But I think, frankly, what a lot of people can agree on is, A, it was unwise to be there in the first place, particularly in the way that we ended up being there, where we were just this occupying force throwing money and lives down the drain. And then B, the way this withdrawal went should have been handled better.
Yes.
Arguably. Maybe that's where people start to disagree, because I think a lot of people are like, no. This is
some
just
people think it's
how
always going to be this
how
way.
it had to be. But
Yeah, and I got to be honest, I don't think I buy this. It's always going to be this way. And honestly, if they're going to make the argument that it's always going to be this way, then that impeaches us being there for the last 20 years.
Yes.
I mean, let's be very clear on that point. Because if that's true, then we could have left 10 years ago. We could have left 5 years ago.
Well, but to their credit, I think literally every single person I've seen who said that has also been like, we shouldn't have been there in the first place. We shouldn't have prosecuted this kind of war, that kind of thing. We've got callers. And so I want to make sure we have time to get to them. 202-521-1320 is the phone number. Brave, calling in from ATL, Atlanta. Brave, you're on. What's on your mind?
Hey, good morning, guys. I just wanted to draw attention to there's a couple clip bits of information in the news. So Tucker Carlson, right? I think people underrate Tucker Carlson because of his political viewpoints, but right now Tucker Carlson is getting away with saying a lot and doing whatever he wants to do, and I think people should tune in because a lot of stuff is getting through the cracks.
Yeah. Wait, I'm sorry, Brave. Real quickly, my take on Tucker Carlson. He is my favorite dude on mainstream news. But it doesn't mean I agree with him on everything. But still, he's like, as far as the people out there, the pundits out there, he says a lot more of the right things than I'm used to people saying. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. Like I've just stopped even considering having to qualify anything when I'm giving it anymore because but to your point, yeah, exactly. Of the mainstream people, I am willing to watch him and just let him go. And what I agree with, what I don't, whatever. But it's always some good information here and there. But what I was trying to get to is he had Laura Logan on, and in the course of the interview, she goes through so much stuff that just really stands out. She goes through how Pakistan supplies Afghanistan, and it's actually paid for by the U.S., right? Because obviously we fund the Pakistan military and intelligence, right? She goes all through this stuff. And then one of the things that she got into that really stood out in my mind, she was talking about how these actions that are being taken in Afghanistan from the invasion all the way down to the supposed failure and coming out of, and of course we all look at it as if it's a failure, but technically it's for someone somewhere, right, the men behind the curtains, whoever you want to call it, but the state that represents the empire, the power that we all talk about in these terms, it was not a failure. It was not a failure. So, but in any case, the point that stood out of my mind was she talked about ambiguity increasing. There's literally a military field manual based on deception and ambiguity increasing, right? So when she said the terms, it popped in my mind because it's one of the things I was reading back when I was prepared for the Q course for Special Forces. I didn't end up making the Special Forces, but I'm just saying one of the things that I started reading into. But I would say to people, check out this interview with Laura Logan on Tucker Carlson, and also on the BBC. On the BBC, they were getting into how the Taliban acquired over the course of some years over $1 billion by making deals and taxing different industries in areas that they were in control of, and that was while we were in country controlling the country supposedly. And then the final thing I'll say is the LBC. You can check them out. There's a nice interview. Well, it's not a nice interview. It's really messed up, but a poppy farmer family representative complaining because the Taliban is coming back in, the USA is going out. And at least during the time that the USA was in control, they were able to make a lot of money growing their poppy, and it was getting taken out on military vehicles, military aircraft, right? That was lets you know that we were tied to that. And I know for a fact because I was there watching. We had Overwatch on fields, on poppy fields that we were guarding. That's crazy. But and I'm pretty sure John Kiriakou could confirm a lot of that stuff. But yeah, I just wanted to share those bits of information.
Interesting.
Well, not just John Kiriakou. I mean, even in Afghanistan files, they made the point that said the only functioning part of the economy were the poppy seeds.
Yes.
I mean, it's in the Washington Post. It was like the only functioning. It says right here, the heroin trade is the only real economy after billions to stop it. A U.S. military officer estimated that 1/3 of the police recruits were drug addicts or Taliban. Yet another called them stealing fools. Keep it going. But you get to a point right here. The United States spent $9 billion to fight the problem over the past 18 years, but Afghan farmers cultivating more opium poppies than ever. Last year, Afghanistan was responsible for 82% of the global opium production, according to the United Nations Officer on Drug and Crime. The only aspect of the economy that worked. Brave, you're right.
And brave. Thank you for the call. One quick thing. I was reading something over the weekend on this specifically. It was an analysis of before U.S. occupation during the early periods, then later on, early 2010s, looking at the distribution of where poppy was grown in the country. And what you see is it gets consolidated, interestingly enough, in areas under Taliban control during this period. So while there may be some instances of I don't doubt it, of U.S. troops guarding poppy fields, Taliban in a weird way was also permissive of them during this time, even though they're turning the corner on it now.
To be fair, I don't know if we were guarding poppy fields. I wouldn't go that far.
Yeah, I thought that's what you said.
No, I didn't mean that part. I just meant, well, I was being very specific right here. It says over the years. It just means 82% of global opium trade was coming out of Afghanistan, and this is after billions of dollars were spent to basically fight the problem of opium.
Yeah.
So, I'm not going to say that they were gardening fields.
And this is, but this is more, this is more like a drug war point in general. I was reading, very interesting take on this stuff. It's looking at the economics, the sort of microeconomics of the transactions of like the growers, the smugglers, the dealers, looking at it. And basically what they're saying is the way that we approach that war, but in general, that drug war did not work in that case. And they went into why. Yeah. And what they're saying was it will not work for the Taliban either. The Taliban has said they're trying to shut down all poppy growth and consumption across the country. What they said is, and here's why it doesn't work. The actual, say you're a smuggler who buys opium and you're trying to smuggle it over to another territory to sell it, where it's going to be more scarce, of course. The actual cost of the opium, of buying it, is only a small part of what you're paying. You've got to pay bribes, you got to pay gas, you got to pay all sorts of things just to get from A to B. In other words, the actual cost of the opium isn't that big. So it gets into this thing about the inelasticity of the demand, but basically, the poppy farmers, all that it does is it drives up the price that they can charge to the smugglers. Yeah. It gives, the more of them you shut down, the more you incentivize new poppy farmers who are getting increasingly scarce to grow their poppies and sell it. And the smugglers who are buying it from them will buy it from them because overall it doesn't actually raise the price that they're going to charge all that much, because most of the fees they're paying, most of the cost comes in transport and all those complications. So it's an interesting piece. And I think it applies to the Taliban and the future of Afghanistan, but we'll have to come back on that. We got other callers in the line. Let's go to Malik, calling in from D.C. Oh, and you know what? One quick note, actually. Sorry for this, Malik. Pfizer just got full approval from the FDA. Yeah. Big headline coming out. The vaccine, Pfizer, Moderna, of course, fully approved, or Pfizer-BioNTech fully approved. We've got Malik calling in from D.C. Malik, you're on the line. What's going on, man?
Thanks for taking my call, fellas. No, that's interesting. I guess the word of the Pfizer clearing by the FDA was kind of circulating last week, so I guess everybody knew that was going to happen. But the reason why I was calling, a couple of things. One, I wanted to, and you may have talked about it earlier, and I may have missed it. The fundraiser dinner with Nancy Pelosi in Napa Valley.
Yeah, we didn't talk about that, but I saw that too. Yep.
Right, and obviously there, we've got a theme here, and not saying that the Republican Party is less of a plutocratic elite, but clearly there's a theme here with the hypocrisy and heavy-handedness of the Democratic Party and particularly liberals, and then obviously I would say the silence of progressives on the violations of civil liberties. And
Malik, I want to cut in here for 1 second just to explain this to people, what you're talking about. It came out this weekend. Nancy Pelosi over in Napa Valley, California, of course, hosting a banquet dinner for, I believe it was like DCCC, or it might have been DNC. It was sort of a fundraising, it was outdoors, to be clear. But you just got all these people sitting maskless along these long banquet tables like 3 or 4 tables abreast, a lot of people in a tight space, just sitting cheek to jowl, sitting right next to each other, and nobody's wearing masks. Yeah. Interestingly enough, most of them are old, so these are people who would be susceptible. I'm assuming they're all vaccinated, but still, Delta's breaking through a lot of this stuff. So the hypocrisy, I just wanted to set up the actual facts of the story. Malik, feel free to take it back up.
Right. No, but I mean, obviously, listen, you know, and you know, I'm not trying to get at you, man, but obviously, it's a little bit presumptuous to assume that all of these parasites, elitists of the ruling class are all vaccinated. I don't believe that. I don't know if you necessarily believe that. And then obviously the explanation that we've been given by the corporate media in the past, when people like Obama and Muriel Bowser at her little shindig, and obviously Gavin Newsom in the same area in Napa Valley, all these ruling class folks don't seem to they don't seem to find it necessary to wear masks, even to push forward their agenda.
Well, it's because they're sophisticated, Malik.
Because they know better than us.
They're sophisticated. The sophistication, you know, it eats COVID. You didn't know that?
Well, and so I'll leave that there. But just one thing, I don't know if you guys talked about the huge protests in Australia and the fact that the police were not only firing...
They were shooting dogs or something, right?
Yeah, but they were actually stepping on the heads. There's video that is widely circulated on Twitter right now of the police hitting a protester. I guess this man was supposedly COVID positive. They hit him with a police car, and then they proceeded to stomp on his head.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of stuff coming out. There are a couple of videos. The story that I sent to you, sent to the group chat yesterday, Jamarl, the one that you brought up about the dogs being killed. This is like a small story, but it's just kind of shocking, and it's just like the barbarity of this thing. Where basically, Australia right now has this lockdown where these states are locked off from each other, and so the protests. I think the big one that you're referring to, Malik, if you're still there, was people on one side of a state border effectively protesting, trying to cross onto the other side of the border of into another state. It's like crossing a street. It's not like there's a fence.
Yeah.
It's like they're trying to move from one region into the other, and the police are stopping them. But there's also this story with these dogs who, it's confirmed, you can look into it, Australia's largest newspaper, I believe it's the Sydney Morning Herald, was reporting on this one, where basically, I don't know why they were doing this exactly, but members of a shelter were trying to go pick up dogs, including a mother dog who had recently given birth. So she's like a new mother, trying to go pick up these dogs and move them to their shelter. The dogs get killed by the government facility that's holding them for no good reason, basically because I guess they're worried about the people coming to pick them up getting sick with COVID. They want to keep that contact down. But it's just like pointless death. And I get it. It's dogs. Human lives arguably matter quite a bit more than the lives of dogs. But these weird different scenarios, and I've seen these videos of, like, again, I don't know the exact context, but a father taking his kid into a hospital and then literally being pulled with the kid screaming, like reaching out to the dad for help. I don't know what's going on there. Probably there's something that doesn't, if not fully explain it or justify it, at least add something. But my point is, that stuff's all coming out. It is a big deal, and thank you for bringing it up, Mel.
They do it here. I mean, I don't know about the dog thing, but ripping people away from their kids. If you went to the hospital today, they wouldn't let you stay in with your parent, with your kid, with your whatever else if you were there. There may be some extenuating circumstance, but all things been equal, they try to separate people in hospitals like that too.
They do. They do. So. Oh, and you know what? My all my grandparents that, like, biologically at this point are dead, I'm sad to say. But my stepdad has some ones that are still living. My grandma on that side, she recently broke her femur, put in the hospital. And it was literally, she didn't see her husband for like a week.
Yeah.
It's the longest they'd been separated for their 50, I don't even know what marriage, this huge marriage. But just because of these, these circumstances, it's only a week, but still, that's the kind of thing that this is doing. And I you know where we are on this one, Jamarl. Everybody who's listening to this show knows that we have broadly been supportive of vaccines, lockdowns, etc. But this whole policy has just gotten
it's way out there. Some of this stuff is way out there.
And some of the stuff is way out there. We got to close the show out there. Everybody, thank you for listening. We'll be back tomorrow morning, folks. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, signing off. See you again, 7 a.m. Eastern, on the other side.